Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I still remember the first time I noticed the sound wasn't just the rain. It was late, close to midnight. I was sitting in my living room watching the rain hammer against the windows. The noise in the basement felt like a dull thud. I thought maybe a pipe was clogged or a loose piece of metal was shifting because of the water pressure. I didn't bother checking at that moment. I felt tired and figured I could wait until morning. But that was the moment it started lodging itself in my mind that something else was going on down there. I live in a 2-story house with an old damp basement. It's not fancy. It's just a place I bought a few years ago because I liked the space. The roof needs some work and the walls sometimes smell like mildew on rainy days. The basement is big enough that I can store all kinds of junk. Boxes of old books, extra tiles, broken furniture, and a few tools I don't use often. The place isn't pretty. The walls are concrete and the floor is uneven. When it rains heavily, I usually hear water dripping. It's a familiar pattern. A soft trickle here and there and the occasional clank of a pipe. But about a month ago, I started to hear something that sounded like quiet, shuffling footsteps. At first, I told myself I was just tired, or that the acoustics in the basement were playing tricks on me. Sometimes water drips in an odd rhythm. But every time the rain came, those footstep sounds returned. They weren't loud. They were more like gentle taps, as if someone was stepping carefully on the concrete floor, trying not to make noise. That's how it felt. I tried to dismiss it, but it stayed in my head. One night I decided to check it out. The rain was coming down hard. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wind rattled the shutters. I grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen drawer. My heart was pounding, even though I kept telling myself there was no reason to panic. I was just going to walk down the basement steps, shine a light around, and make sure nothing was out of place. If I'm being honest, though, my hands were shaking when I opened the basement door. My basement has a narrow staircase with a single light bulb at the top. That bulb flickers sometimes because the wiring isn't great. I stepped onto the first stair, and the wood creaked under my weight. The damp smell of concrete and old cardboard boxes hit my nose right away. The air felt colder than usual. I tried to breathe slowly. The flashlight felt slippery in my hand, and I had to keep readjusting my grip. I reached the bottom step and looked around. My eyes scanned the shelves, the stacks of boxes, and the old furniture I'd piled up against the far wall. I stood there for a moment, waiting for another sound. Rain dripped through some crack in the foundation, producing a steady tapping noise. I listened carefully. Nothing else happened for a few seconds. Then I heard a faint shuffle behind one of the metal shelves on my left. My skin prickled. My throat went dry. I aimed my flashlight in that direction and moved forward. The shelves cast long shadows on the wall. I walked around the side of the shelf, shining the light across each level. There was nothing unusual there, just dusty boxes, some old cans of paint, and a few rusty tools. I stayed there, waiting, listening for any other noise. My breathing felt too loud. My heart was beating so hard I could feel the pulse in my ears. But I didn't hear anything else. I checked behind the shelves, in the corners, and even behind an old dresser I'd propped up against the back wall. There was nobody there, and there were no signs of any intrusion. No footprints, no wet marks, no open boxes. After 10 minutes, I told myself I was just imagining things. I went upstairs, locked the basement door, and turned off the light. I felt tense, but I tried to brush it off. A few days later, the sound came back during another rainstorm. This time, I was almost sure it sounded like footsteps moving slowly in circles. I got that same rush of adrenaline. My hands started shaking a bit. My mouth got dry. I remember telling myself, "Don't get carried away. It's probably water dripping in a weird pattern." But I couldn't ignore how much it sounded like someone pacing on the concrete. The pace was uneven, sometimes pausing, then resuming. It reminded me of a person trying not to trip in the dark. I went downstairs again, feeling more cautious. I didn't like the sense of vulnerability I had in that basement. The single light bulb hardly illuminated anything, so I kept my flashlight on, sweeping it across the walls and the ceiling. I thought maybe there was a leak in the pipes or something hitting the floor, but I saw no leaks. The basement was drier than I expected, given the heavy rain. There were no puddles, just a thin layer of dampness near the outer edges of the floor. I walked around each row of shelves, then behind the old furniture. I looked inside a few boxes. My heart was pounding so loud that I felt every beat in my chest. I gripped the flashlight tighter. The air felt still, as if everything froze the moment I entered. I kept searching, but I found nothing. No broken locks on the windows, no damp footprints. It was just me and some dusty junk. Still, I had the unmistakable feeling someone had been there a second before I shone the light. The sense of presence was thick, almost like the air was charged. I went back upstairs and locked the door again. That night I barely slept. I kept hearing faint noises. It was a mixture of the rain and some unidentifiable thumping. Around 2 a.m, I pulled the covers over my head, feeling stupid, but also scared. My heartbeat wouldn't slow down. I kept thinking about the shape I thought I saw moving behind the shelves. It was just a glimpse, but it felt too real. Over the next week, I avoided going down there when it rained. I kept the door locked. I moved my toolbox upstairs to the hall closet so I wouldn't have any reason to go down. Part of me felt silly for being nervous, but another part of me didn't want to confront the basement again. When the weather was dry, I went downstairs to do laundry without any problems. Everything looked normal during the day. Nothing had been moved. I didn't hear anything strange. It was just that combination of darkness, dampness, and the heavy downpour that seemed to trigger the activity. Then came another storm, one of the heaviest of the season. The sky went dark in the afternoon. Rain fell in thick sheets. Wind gusts battered the house. Around 8 o'clock that night, I was reading a book in the living room. The wind howled, and the windows rattled in their frames. Then, over the sound of the storm, I heard a distinct thump from the basement. I froze. My eyes went straight to the basement door. Another thump echoed, followed by a subtle dragging sound. My muscles tensed. I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. I told myself, check it out now or you'll never relax. So I walked to the closet, took out my flashlight, and made sure I had my cell phone in my pocket. The short walk to the basement door felt longer than usual. I turned the knob, and the door squeaked open. The light bulb was on, but it flickered. The shadows wavered at the bottom of the stairs. I took one step down, then another. The smell of damp concrete and dust surrounded me. I held the flashlight up, scanning the space. I reached the basement floor and paused. The air felt colder than the rest of the house. My skin tingled. I heard another shuffle coming from the far corner, near an old armoire I'd stored against the wall. My brain went into overdrive. I thought maybe an animal got inside, like a raccoon or a possum. That would be odd, but not impossible. I stepped carefully, keeping the flashlight pointed ahead. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but I felt a knot in my stomach. I got closer to the armoire and noticed the door on it was slightly open. I remembered closing it a few months ago when I put some old coats in there. Now it was open about an inch. I took a deep breath and reached out, grabbing the door. I yanked it fully open in one swift motion. The flashlight beam landed on a couple of dusty coats and a stack of folded blankets. Nothing moved. I pushed aside the coats, checking for any animals or anything else that could explain the noise. I found nothing. A sudden thump sounded from across the room. I spun around, heart pounding. The noise came from behind a tall metal shelf. It sounded like someone hitting the shelf with a fist. I hurried over, shining the light. All I saw were more boxes stacked on the lower shelves. My body was tense. My jaw felt tight. I muttered, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice echoed slightly. No answer. I clenched my flashlight, feeling my palms sweat. I kept walking, checking every corner. I looked behind a big wooden table between the washing machine and the dryer, and near the old furnace in the back. The basement lights flickered again, giving me a split second of darkness. During that moment, I heard another shuffle, but I couldn't pinpoint the direction. When the light came back on, nothing had changed. I stood still listening. The only sounds were the steady drip of rainwater and the distant rumble of thunder. My chest felt tight, and I noticed my forehead was damp with sweat. After a few minutes, the noises stopped. I stayed in the basement, standing near the shelves, waiting to see if anything else would happen. My flashlight started to feel heavy, and my breath felt strained. Finally, I climbed back upstairs, locking the door behind me. I kept my ear against the door for a while, listening for more noises. I heard nothing but the storm. That night, I thought about calling a friend or maybe asking someone to come over and check the basement with me. But I felt embarrassed. I didn't want to drag anyone else into what might just be my imagination. However, the physical tension in my body told me I wasn't imagining it. The sounds were real. I just couldn't explain them. Over the next few days, the weather cleared. I went down to the basement in broad daylight to inspect everything more thoroughly. I checked all the windows for signs of forced entry. They were locked. I examined the outer walls for cracks. There were some hairline cracks, but nothing big enough for a person to slip through. I made sure the tools were still locked up. None of the boxes had been opened or moved. I took pictures of the basement layout on my phone, hoping to notice if anything changed after the next storm. Then I went upstairs and tried to push it out of my mind. But when the next storm arrived, the footstep noises came back. This time, I heard a faint squeaking, like a door hinge. It was followed by soft bumps, one after another, as if someone was knocking gently on the concrete walls. My body reacted instantly. I felt my pulse racing and I got a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I tried to ignore it, thinking, let me just sit here and see if it goes away. But the noises continued for several minutes. Eventually, I couldn't stand it. I had to see if something was happening down there. I took the flashlight again and headed into the basement. The light bulb flickered again, making everything feel jumpy. I checked around, and every time I walked toward a certain corner, the noises seemed to shift to another spot. It was like a game of cat and mouse. I thought maybe the noises were echoing, but I noticed that they always stopped when I got close. I opened drawers, looked inside old trunks, and even tapped on the walls to see if there was a hollow section. I found nothing. I stood in the center of the room, feeling my heart pound. My clothes felt damp, partly from the humidity, partly from my sweat. Then I heard a soft shuffle near the stairs. I swung around, shining the flashlight. The stairwell was empty, but I heard a faint breathing sound, or at least I thought I did. It was like a slow inhale and exhale. My hands started to shake again, and I gripped the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. I walked to the stairs. The sound stopped. I aimed the flashlight at each step, then the small space under the stairs where I keep some paint cans. No one was there. I stood there, feeling my chest tighten. I could hear my own breathing. The basement door at the top of the stairs was half open, letting in a weak slice of light from the hallway. I climbed back up, shut the door firmly, and locked it. My body was trembling. My forehead was dripping sweat. My legs felt shaky. After that night, I started going downstairs less and less. I told myself I would only go in the daytime to do laundry or grab something if I absolutely needed it. Even in daylight, I sometimes heard a faint shuffle when I was down there. It wasn't as intense as when it rained, but it was enough to keep me on edge. Each time I checked behind shelves and inside boxes. I never found any intruder. There were no footprints or water trails that would indicate a person walking around. But the feeling of a presence never left. Now, whenever the sky darkens and I see the forecast calls for heavy rain, I feel my stomach clench. I've tried playing music loudly to drown out the basement sounds, but that doesn't stop me from imagining it. At night, when the storm is pounding the roof, I sometimes hear those slow, deliberate footsteps below. They come and go, with pauses in between. Sometimes it sounds like pacing. Other times it's just a single thump, like a footstep with a short pause afterward. I check my locks every night. The windows in the basement stay shut and my tools are secured. I haven't seen any evidence of a break-in or an animal living down there. But the noises continue, always coinciding with the rain. I still feel that tension in my body whenever I hear them. My shoulders tighten and my heart races. Every time I try to investigate, I find no one. Yet the chills never stop. Each time I walk down those steps, I feel like someone is watching me from just out of sight, moving behind a shelf or slipping around the corner. I can't see them, but I sense them there, waiting for me to leave so they can resume their slow walk across the basement floor. I wish I could explain it, but I can't. I only know that every rainy night, the footsteps return, and every time they do, my skin crawls. That's my story. I've been living with these strange basement sounds for a while now. They haven't gone away, and I've stopped trying to convince myself it's just in my head. Something is causing those footsteps. I haven't seen any shape or person clearly, but I've caught glimpses of a blurred figure darting behind furniture. The presence feels unmistakable. Whenever I turn on the light and aim my flashlight, it disappears or goes silent. Then, as soon as I let my guard down, the noises start again. I don't know if I'll ever get a definitive answer. I've considered hiring a contractor to check for structural problems or hidden spaces, but I keep putting it off. Maybe I'm afraid of what they might find. For now, I live with it. On stormy nights, I sit in the living room, keep the basement door locked, and try not to let the tapping and shuffling sounds get to me. Sometimes I turn up the TV or scroll through my phone to distract myself. But deep down, I'm always aware of that presence beneath me, walking on the damp concrete, stirring up fear in the darkness. And that's how it remains, night after night, every time the heavy rain hits the roof. I never thought I'd be afraid of a simple stretch of railroad tracks. 2 weeks ago, I was just another guy looking for a quiet place to get some exercise after a long day. Now I can't get those noises out of my head. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that metal scraping and that heavy creak echoing in the back of my mind. It makes my stomach clench. I can feel the tightness in my chest when I remember what happened that night. I want to push it all aside, but I can't. I live in a small town surrounded by fields and a thin strip of woodland. We have an old railway that cuts right through the outskirts. It used to run freight trains a long time ago, but the line got deactivated years before I moved here. Most of the tracks are still in place, though. You can see patches of rust where the rails catch the sunlight. The railroad ties are half buried in dirt and weeds in some spots. A few abandoned freight cars sit further down past a bend, locked behind a dented chain-link fence. Everyone in town says those cars are empty, just metal shells collecting dust. Some folks like to poke around that area during the day, but I rarely see anyone there at night. I started walking or jogging along the tracks about 3 months ago. At first, I picked that route because it was flat and mostly clear, aside from a few fallen branches. It also felt more private than walking around the well-lit streets near the town center. When the sun sets, that whole area goes dark. There's only one street lamp near the crossing, and it's pretty dim. I liked the quiet. My mind would drift while I paced myself. Sometimes I'd do a light jog, other times I'd just walk. I'd listen to the crunch of my shoes on gravel, or the slight squeak of my sneakers on metal. It felt good, peaceful, in a strange way. Around 2 weeks ago, I noticed something off. I was in the middle of my routine, light jog, nothing special, when I caught a faint screech. It sounded like metal scraping on metal. A second later, I heard a heavy groan, almost like an old hinge moving under stress. I stopped running. I looked around. I used the flashlight on my phone to check the tracks ahead and behind. I didn't see anything. The trees were motionless. The air was calm. I thought maybe a piece of the old track had shifted under my weight, but I couldn't see any movement. I wrote it off as old, rusty metal. Maybe the temperature change was making it expand or contract. It could have been an animal stepping on a loose section. I didn't spend too long thinking about it. Over the next few nights, that noise came back. Each time it sounded the same, a soft scraping, like two pieces of jagged metal rubbing against each other, and then a deeper creak. Sometimes I'd stop dead in my tracks and hold my breath. I'd listen, waiting for a second round of sounds. Usually I'd hear nothing else. I'd shrug it off again and finish my walk. But each time, the hairs on my neck stood up. The back of my shirt would cling to my skin. I tried telling myself it was normal. An old railway has plenty of loose parts. Maybe the wind was pushing something around. I tried not to think too hard about it. 3 nights ago, I had a tough day at the office. I left work late around 11 p.m. By the time I changed clothes and got to the tracks, it was almost midnight. The moon wasn't out. I remember the sky being cloudy, no stars visible. The air felt a bit humid. I walked onto the rails and started my usual route. My phone flashlight only lit a small circle on the ground, so I kept my eyes on that spot. Every few steps I'd glance around. Everything was pitch black. The branches overhead made the darkness even thicker. I took a deep breath. The quiet felt heavier than usual. About 10 minutes in, that scraping sound started again. I froze and raised my phone. My heart began pounding as I turned around. I swung the light across the tracks. Nothing. I could only see a few yards in front of me. Beyond that, everything faded into black. The sound went on for another second or two, then stopped. I didn't like the feeling in my gut. It was like a knot twisting. I tried to shake it off and resumed my walk. I kept my pace brisk. My footsteps echoed on the rails. After a minute, I heard it again, but louder this time. It was that same metal-on-metal scraping, but it sounded closer. Then came the creak. It was deeper, like a door hinge straining under heavy weight. I spun around again, shining my phone light toward the direction of the sound. I only saw the empty tracks. The darkness beyond was absolute. It reminded me of a black wall. I stood still, hardly breathing, waiting for any movement or shape. My pulse hammered in my ears. My arms felt cold and I could feel my shirt sticking to my back. But there was nothing to see. I told myself I was just jumpy. Maybe a wild animal was moving debris nearby. Raccoons or stray dogs sometimes wander around. Metal scraps or trash could make weird noises if kicked around. I tried to swallow my nerves and keep going. But the next time I heard it, it seemed to match my steps. When I sped up, the scraping sped up. When I slowed, it slowed. It felt impossible, but I could sense it behind me. I could almost picture something dragging itself along the rails in sync with my pace. My throat went dry, and I could feel sweat trickling down my temple. I decided I'd had enough. I spun around and aimed the flashlight at full strength, determined to see if there was anyone there. I squinted, scanning the area. The tracks behind me were empty. The rails vanished into the shadows. The trees on either side were silent. My heart was racing so hard I felt shaky. I waited, not moving a muscle. Then I heard the scrape again. It was off to my left, maybe a few yards away. I jerked the light in that direction. I saw only tangled brush and the faint shape of tree trunks. No eyes, no figure, no sign of an animal. My jaw tightened, and I realized my hands were clenched. Then that heavy creak came from behind me, near the tracks. I pivoted so fast I nearly lost my balance. The flashlight beam trembled across the old rusty rails. Still nothing. I felt a surge of adrenaline. My legs wanted to run, but I forced myself to stay put for another few seconds. My mind was racing with questions. Could there be someone messing with me? Could it be a piece of machinery shifting in the abandoned freight cars? I decided to backtrack slowly. I walked backward, keeping the light aimed at the tracks. My breathing was shallow and quick. The sound didn't repeat during those few moments. I finally turned around and walked quickly back the way I came. My pace broke into a jog. By the time I reached the road, my heart felt like it was ready to burst out of my chest. I glanced over my shoulder one more time before I left the railroad behind. The darkness seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart, but I saw nothing. The next day, I tried to act normal. I went to work, talked to coworkers, and kept my story to myself. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But that night I skipped my usual walk. I sat in my living room, phone in hand, staring at the time. My brain replayed the noises. Each replay made my spine tighten. I tried to watch TV and relax, but I kept drifting off in my head. Around midnight, I peeked out the window. The street was empty. No cars passed by. There was a slight breeze rustling the trees. I felt a sudden urge to drive out there and see if I could catch anyone in the act. But then I remembered the fear I felt the night before. I stayed put. The second night, I thought about going again. I actually put my running shoes on and grabbed my phone. I got as far as my front door, then I stopped. The memory of that scraping and creaking made my stomach churn. I couldn't shake the image of something trailing behind me. I turned off the porch light and went back inside. I felt unsettled, almost ashamed that I was letting a weird sound scare me off. But I couldn't ignore the chill that crept up my neck every time I imagined going back. The following morning, I decided to talk to a friend of mine, Renato, who works at a local auto shop. He's lived here his whole life, and he likes to hunt and fish in the nearby woods. When I brought up the old tracks, he shrugged. He said sometimes the rails expand and contract, causing squeaks or pops. He also mentioned that some transients have been known to camp near the abandoned cars. He recommended I bring a flashlight and maybe some pepper spray if I insist on going at night. He didn't seem worried. He said I was probably just hearing old metal shifting around. I nodded, but I felt uneasy. The way those sounds followed my steps didn't feel like random noise. After work that same day, I drove out to the crossing before sunset. I parked by the side of the road near the lone street lamp. I wanted to check the tracks in daylight to see if there was any sign of tampering or footprints. The rails looked the same as always, rusty, with a few scattered rocks and broken branches. I walked down 100 yards or so, then back up the other side. I didn't see any fresh tire tracks or footprints near the soft dirt areas. There were some old beer cans and a couple of empty snack wrappers. Nothing stood out as suspicious. I kept expecting to see a broken piece of machinery or a bent section of rail, but everything looked normal. I felt a slight sense of relief seeing it in daylight. But as the sun sank lower, I noticed how quickly the shadows stretched across the rails. The moment the light began to fade, that uneasy feeling bubbled up again. It was the memory of standing there in the dark, hearing something creep closer. I told myself I'd leave before nightfall. I stayed maybe another 15 minutes just to be sure I hadn't missed anything. Then I got back in my car and headed home. Last night, I stuck to my decision. I didn't go near the tracks. Instead, I took a short run around a few blocks in the residential area. It felt safer. The streetlights kept everything in view. I passed the local bakery, the small church, and a row of closed shops. Everything was quiet, but in a comforting way. When I glanced at my phone, I noticed it was almost midnight. An image of the deserted railroad crossed my mind. My muscles tensed. I pushed the thought aside and ran back home. Now, I'm sitting in my living room again, staring at the clock. It's 10:45 p.m. The tracks keep calling to me in a strange way. Part of me wants to find an explanation, to prove it's just old metal or a person wandering around. But every time I picture myself standing there alone in the dark, I feel my palms start to sweat. My chest tightens. I hear the scraping in my head, followed by that dreadful creak. I can almost feel the rails vibrating under my feet. My breath comes in short gasps just thinking about it. I haven't told many people about this. I'm worried they'll say I'm overreacting. Maybe I am. But I've walked that line at night for months without any real scare until now. Something changed. Something out there in that long stretch of rusted metal and thin trees caught on to me. I don't know if it's a person, an animal, or just random physics. All I know is that on that midnight walk, it felt personal, like it matched my steps on purpose. For now, I'm steering clear of the tracks after sunset. During the day, I feel fine driving by or even walking near them. But the idea of being out there alone at night, hearing that grinding noise approach, makes my stomach twist into a knot. I can't shake the feeling that if I go back, I'll hear it again. And this time, I might not be able to stand there and pretend it's just a trick of the wind. I don't want to find out what's causing it. It's better if I don't. At least, that's what I keep telling myself. I'm not sure what happens next. Maybe I'll go back with a friend, or maybe I'll avoid the place altogether. I keep waiting for an explanation to surface. Some report of a broken piece of equipment or a local rumor about strange noises on the tracks. But everything's quiet. People go about their business like nothing's wrong. Maybe it's all in my head. But my gut says otherwise. And until I'm certain, I'm staying away from those tracks after dark. It's not worth the cold sweat, the racing heart, or the thought that something might be following me step for step in that deep blackness. I can handle a lot, but I'm not ready to handle that. Not yet. I never expected a quiet office building to make my heart pound at night. I always saw it as a modern, efficient place, with bright hallways and fresh paint on every wall. But there's something about those late hours that changes everything. When most people leave, the place turns silent and every small noise feels amplified. That's what got me. It was just another late night, until I heard those steps. My job involves a lot of paperwork and data entry. I work for a marketing firm on one of the top floors of a large commercial building. During normal hours, the office is never quiet. Keyboards click, phones ring, coworkers chat. You can hear the echo of conversation bouncing off the glass partitions. Once 8 o'clock rolls around, almost everyone heads out. I usually stay because I like to get a head start on reports for the next day. Sometimes it's just me and maybe one or two other people from different departments, but we rarely cross paths in those late hours. The cleaning crew comes in and does their rounds, but they're usually gone by 9. On that particular night, I was rushing to finalize a report. I needed to finish by the next morning, so I decided to stay until it was done. By around 8:30, I noticed how quiet the floor had become. I heard a distant hum from the air conditioning vents. That's normal around here, but everything else was still. I wasn't scared, just very aware of the emptiness. At around 9:15, I sat at my desk, typing the last few paragraphs of a project summary, when I heard footsteps outside my office. They were heavy, like someone in hard-soled shoes walking down the corridor. It came from the main hallway, the one that leads to the elevator bank. At first, I thought it was one of the night shift cleaning staff or a security guard. I paused and listened. The steps sounded uneven, like whoever was out there was in a hurry or limping. It was strange because I couldn't recall seeing anyone on the floor in the previous hour. Still, it wasn't impossible. People sometimes come in to grab something they forgot, or maybe a coworker decided to stay late too. I got up, walked to my office door, and checked the corridor. The lights were on, but they're always a bit dimmed after certain hours, almost like an energy-saving mode. There was no one in sight. The hallway has a row of tinted windows on one side, and on the other side there are offices and meeting rooms. There's nowhere obvious to hide and no reason for anyone to hide there in the first place. I took a few steps forward, looked left and right, waited, but saw nothing. I felt a little confused. I even called out, "Hey, anyone there?" My voice sounded too loud in the quiet hallway. I didn't get a response, so I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the footsteps came from the floor above or below. Sometimes sound travels in weird ways through the building vents. I went back to my desk and tried to focus on my work. After a few minutes, I heard those footsteps again. They sounded close, then faded like they were moving toward the stairwell. This time I paid attention to the direction of the noise. It was definitely coming from the corridor that leads to the emergency stairs. The steps were distinct, heavier than the usual shuffle of someone in sneakers. They had a firm, rhythmic pattern. It made me uneasy because it didn't sound normal. I felt a small rush of adrenaline. My heart beat faster and I got that prickly sensation on my arms. I stood up, grabbed my phone, and walked out into the hallway again. The lights in the corridor flickered just once, then settled. Sometimes that happens when the automatic sensors adjust. I heard nothing at first, only the gentle hum of air conditioning. Then there was a subtle echo, like something tapping on the floor near the stairwell door. I followed the sound, keeping my footsteps quiet. I approached the stairwell door and pushed it open. The stairwell itself was well lit, with that typical white fluorescent lighting. It smelled like disinfectant. My footsteps echoed as I stepped onto the concrete landing. I looked up, looked down, but there was nobody. I even leaned over the railing to see if someone was below. It was completely empty. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead and a little knot in my stomach. It wasn't exactly terror, but I felt tense. My mind started racing. Could there be someone messing around? A prank? Or was it a maintenance issue, like pipes rattling that sounded like footsteps? It didn't match the typical creaks you sometimes hear in big buildings, though. These were deliberate step-by-step sounds. I lingered in the stairwell for another minute, trying to decide if I should check another floor. I decided not to. I felt uneasy about leaving my floor. If there was some stranger wandering around, I didn't want to corner them. I went back to my desk, finished my work as quickly as possible, and left by 10. As I walked to the elevator, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be watching me. But I didn't hear anything else that night. The next morning, I spoke with Wilson, the building's night shift supervisor. He usually sits in a small office in the lobby after the main security staff leaves. He's also the one who walks around each floor to check that everything's locked up. I asked him if he knew anyone else was on my floor the previous night. He shook his head. Then he told me he'd also heard strange noises more than once, usually around 9 or 9:30. He said the footsteps never led him to a person, just empty hallways. His eyes looked tired when he explained it. He admitted it made him nervous, but he didn't want to bring it up to building management because he didn't want to seem superstitious. I nodded and told him I understood. It was a new building with modern security systems. I doubted it had some hidden past, but we were both puzzled. That conversation stuck with me. I wondered if maybe we had an intruder sneaking in after hours. It didn't make a lot of sense because the building has cameras on most floors, plus electronic keycard systems. I decided to keep my eyes open and maybe stay late again to see if it happened a second time. A few days later, I was back at the office until almost 9. I made a point to leave my door slightly open so I could hear everything in the hallway more clearly. By 9:15, the place was silent except for the low hum of the ventilation. I realized I was sitting on edge waiting for something to happen. My heart was beating faster than normal. I kept looking at the clock, then out at the corridor. Nothing happened for a good half hour. I started to think maybe it was just some weird one-time thing. Suddenly, I heard the footsteps again, louder than before. They started near the elevator bank, a series of 6 or 7 heavy steps, then paused. My chest felt tight, and I stood up right away. I moved quietly toward the door and listened. The footsteps started again, this time heading in my direction. My palms were sweating and I held my breath. It sounded like someone was walking with intent, not wandering aimlessly. Step, step, step. I waited by the door, ready to swing it open the moment I heard them pass. I thought maybe I could catch whoever it was in the act. The steps got closer, but just as they reached what I guessed was a few feet away, they stopped. I heard silence. I took a quick breath, then opened the door wide. The corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights were steady, not flickering. Nothing moved. I looked left, then right. I stepped out. My legs felt tense and my pulse was racing. I walked down the hall to the elevator area. Nobody was there. I turned back toward the emergency stairs. The door was closed. I stood there for a moment, feeling like a fool. No one was in sight and the building was as still as ever. I decided to check the cameras the next day. Wilson let me peek at some of the overnight footage from my floor's corridor. The cameras are near each elevator bank, pointing down the main hallway. The footage from around 9:40 didn't show anyone. The corridor looked empty, but at the exact time I remembered hearing the footsteps, I could see myself stepping out of my office and looking around. It confirmed what I already knew. I heard steps, but there was nobody visible. That was when I started feeling real fear. It wasn't that I believed in ghosts or anything. I just hated the idea that something didn't add up in a place I felt safe. The office was supposed to be predictable. It's the same environment every day. Yet now I felt a sense of dread whenever I considered working late. I tried to avoid staying past 8 the rest of that week, but deadlines piled up, and I had no choice. On Friday, I was again in my office after 9. This time, I felt more prepared. I had Wilson's phone number in case I heard the footsteps again. Sure enough, around 9:15, I heard that same pattern of heavy steps. My throat went dry. I grabbed my phone and dialed Wilson. I whispered, "They're here." I hear them again. Wilson agreed to come up right away. He told me to stay calm and keep an eye on the corridor if I felt safe doing so. I walked to the door and stood there, phone in hand, listening. The steps echoed, moving away from my office, heading toward the stairs. The sound was crystal clear this time, no doubt about it. I swung the door open and took a few steps out. My heart pounded against my rib cage. I followed the sound until I reached the stairwell. I pushed the door open, again seeing nothing. While I was standing at the stairwell entrance, Wilson arrived through the elevator. I waved him over, and we both stood there, waiting for any hint of movement. We slowly walked down one flight of stairs, then went up one flight, checking each landing. It was empty. We glanced around corners, listened for doors opening. Everything was quiet. After a couple of minutes, we returned to my floor, feeling confused and tense. Wilson looked as rattled as I felt. We didn't see or hear another thing that night, but we both felt like something was off. After that, the footsteps became an ongoing topic between me and Wilson. We'd exchange glances in the lobby or in the elevator, and he'd give me a quick shake of the head if nothing weird had happened. If we did hear them, it was always around the same time. We started joking that the building had a 9 o'clock walker. But it wasn't funny. We both felt the unease in our bones. It never escalated to anything more than footsteps. No flickering lights beyond the normal sensor adjustments. No voices, no shadows. Just steps. Heavy, deliberate steps that vanished as soon as we tried to track them down. One night, Wilson tested an idea. He turned off the lights on my floor just before 9 to see if the darkness changed anything. We stood there with flashlights, waiting in silence. The corridor looked different in the dark, longer and more claustrophobic. My heart pounded harder because I couldn't see as well. We waited for about half an hour, but the steps never came that night. It was the only time we tried that, because it made us both uneasy to stand in the dark. We didn't prove anything, but it showed that the phenomenon wasn't predictable. I still don't have a final explanation. The building is new, with no known tragedies or stories of accidents. The owners pride themselves on having modern systems, strong security, and a clean record. Yet I can't ignore what I've experienced. Wilson hears it too, and we both know it's not normal building sounds or random people walking around. I've talked with a few coworkers who sometimes stay late. Some of them mentioned hearing odd noises, but no one else described these heavy footsteps. They either shrugged it off or assumed it was a maintenance thing. Now, whenever I work late, I keep my office door closed. I try to finish before that usual 9 o'clock window. If I can't, I blast music in my headphones to drown out any strange sounds. But I still catch myself glancing at the door every few minutes. Sometimes I think I hear a distant thump and my chest tightens. Other times, the building stays silent, and I leave without incident. Wilson and I remain curious. We both agree there's something there, though we can't prove it. We've seen the security footage with our own eyes, showing empty halls while we clearly heard footsteps in real time. We've checked the stairwell and other floors. We've tried to catch someone in the act, but always come up empty-handed. To this day, we don't have a clue who or what is making those steps. All we know is that they're real to our ears, and they echo through those corridors like a reminder that empty spaces aren't always as empty as they seem. I haven't told many people about this because most wouldn't believe me, or they'd say it's just my imagination. I'm not looking for attention or trying to spread rumors that the building is haunted. I just can't ignore what I've heard. Wilson can't ignore it either. We still talk about it now and then, especially when we cross paths during late shifts. I'm aware that I might never get answers, but I know what I heard, and I know that silence sometimes hides things we can't explain. For now, I'll keep my office door closed, try to get my work done earlier, and let the footsteps wander the halls if that's what they decide to do. I never expected that my side job as a rideshare driver would lead me to a place so dark and unsettling. It was a quiet night, around 2 in the morning, and my phone barely buzzed with any requests. I was about to call it quits when the app suddenly pinged with a new ride. The pickup location was on the outskirts of town near a cluster of farms and ranches. I glanced at the passenger's name. It was a common name, nothing that set off alarms. I figured it would be an easy trip. I headed out there, driving down long, empty roads. My headlights cut through the darkness, but the farther I went, the fewer streetlights I saw. Eventually, I found myself on a dirt road. It was lined with tall trees that blocked any moonlight. The app directed me to a spot that looked deserted. There was no public lighting, no houses that I could see. Just a faint outline of what I thought could be fences or large gates in the distance. I slowed down and looked around. The only thing that stood out was a figure by the side of the road. It was a man, tall, wearing a hat. The silhouette was hard to read, but he didn't move when my car approached. I rolled down the window a little and said his name. He just nodded and opened the rear door without speaking. He got in and closed the door behind him. He leaned forward just enough to confirm his name. I asked if he was heading to the location I saw on the app, which was marked as a spot in the industrial district about 15 kilometers away. He said yes. His voice was low and rough. I looked at him in the rearview mirror, but the darkness of the car made it hard to see his face clearly. He wore that hat pulled down, shading most of his features. I pulled away slowly, trying not to kick up too much dust on that dirt road. The quiet felt heavier than usual. Sometimes people are tired or drunk at this hour, but something about him felt different. It wasn't the usual vibe. He just sat there, staring out the window, barely moving. After a minute or two, I heard this faint mumbling coming from the back seat. I couldn't pick out any specific words. It sounded like a prayer or some sort of lament. He spoke so softly that it was almost just breath against the air. I glanced in the mirror, but I only saw the side of his face. It looked like he was focusing on something far beyond the glass. I tried to keep my eyes on the road, but my heart rate picked up. It wasn't a safe area to be distracted. The roads out there were winding, and the night was too dark to let my guard down. The app's GPS showed me the route, which ran through a few back roads before hitting a main highway. As we got closer to the highway, I felt a bit more relaxed. Streetlights started appearing, and I could see the reflection in my mirrors again. The man kept mumbling, sometimes stopping for a while, then starting again. I considered asking if he was okay, but I decided to keep quiet. I didn't want to pry or provoke him. I just wanted to get him to his destination and finish the trip. When we hit the main road, I noticed that his posture changed. He stopped leaning against the window and sat up straighter. He looked around like he was checking where we were. I asked if the route was correct. He nodded without speaking. The tension in the car felt heavy. I kept driving, following the directions on my screen. About 10 minutes later, we were close to the industrial zone. It was a big area filled with warehouses, some factories, and wide, deserted streets at that hour. Most places were closed, and only a few security lights glowed in the distance. The passenger shifted again. I heard the rustle of his clothing against the seat. We exited the main road, turned onto a side street, and he leaned forward again. He told me to keep going straight for a couple of blocks. I did. The area was dark, with tall fences and large metal gates. Some lots were completely empty, just large open areas filled with dirt or piles of scrap metal. He told me to pull over next to one of those lots. I checked the app and I saw that our destination was still a couple of blocks ahead, but he insisted that I stop. My gut told me something was off. I slowed the car and looked around. There were no lights, no buildings that looked in use, just that vacant lot with a gate that hung off its hinges. It looked like no one had been there in ages. I parked near the curb, leaving the engine running. He sat there for a moment, not moving. I wondered if maybe he was in some kind of trouble or if he planned to meet someone here. My mind started racing with possible scenarios. Then he grabbed the door handle, paused, and opened the door. He stepped out slowly. It was quiet enough that I heard the crunch of gravel under his boots. The air felt cold against my arms, even though I had the heater on low in the car. Then he turned back, leaning down so his face was level with the open door. I could see him more clearly because of the dim glow from my dashboard. His eyes were darker than I expected. They didn't reflect any light. He said, "Thanks for the ride, but this isn't where I'm supposed to stay." I froze for a second, not sure how to respond. He closed the door gently, not slamming it. Then he just walked off into that empty lot. The darkness swallowed him up. I didn't hear footsteps after a few seconds. He just disappeared. I stayed there, engine idling, unsure if I should wait or leave. My mind was full of questions. Was he meeting someone? Was he in danger? I looked at my phone. The app showed that the ride was still technically in progress since we hadn't reached the pinned destination. I waited a bit longer, maybe a minute or two, but nothing changed. No movement, no sound. Just the wind rattling that old chain-link fence. I decided to end the ride on the app myself. The system asked for a reason, and I just typed something about the passenger leaving early. Then I pulled away, checking my mirrors. The lot remained dark. I didn't see any movement or lights in the distance. I felt uneasy. My stomach felt tight, like a knot had formed there. My fingers were gripping the steering wheel a bit too hard. I drove a few blocks to get to a better lit street. I noticed my heart was pounding. My hands were a little sweaty. I didn't know why that situation had gotten to me so much, but it did. There's something about that man's voice, the low mumbling, and that final phrase, "This isn't where I'm supposed to stay." I replayed it in my mind while I navigated back to the highway. It gave me chills. I kept checking my rearview mirror, feeling like I was being followed, even though the road behind me was empty. I tried to calm myself by putting on the radio, but it didn't help. I kept thinking that maybe I should have asked if he needed help, or maybe I should have refused the ride when I saw how strange the pickup location was. But I had no reason to do that at the start. He was just another passenger, or so I believed. Back on the main highway, I headed towards the city center. The streetlights felt comforting, and I passed a few convenience stores that were still open. I considered stopping, getting out, and grabbing a coffee or a quick snack just to ground myself. But I thought I might see something or someone that would spark my anxiety again. I decided to keep going. I checked the app to see if I wanted another ride. Part of me wanted to finish on a better note. Another part of me wanted to go straight home. I ended up going offline, not wanting to risk another odd ride that night. My mind was still stuck on that passenger. The tension in my shoulders lingered. As I drove toward my apartment, I noticed every shadow on the sidewalk. I stared at people waiting at bus stops, wondering if any of them had that same quiet stance he had. My thoughts kept jumping to the possibility that he was in some serious trouble. His voice sounded pained, and I had no idea what he was mumbling. It could have been anything. But I also reminded myself that some people just have a different way of being. Maybe he was lost or confused, or maybe he had personal issues I didn't understand. I finally parked in my usual spot near my building. The lot was empty at that hour. Normally, I'd just head straight upstairs and forget about it. But that night, I sat in my car for a while. I looked around to make sure no one was approaching. I turned off the engine and listened to the ticking sound it made as it cooled down. My hands were still shaking. I clenched them a few times to settle my nerves. Then I stepped out, scanned the area again, and hurried to my building's entrance. The hallway was quiet. The elevator light flickered a bit. Once inside my apartment, I locked the door immediately and double-checked it. I kicked off my shoes and turned on every light in my living room and kitchen. I tried to brush off the feeling that I brought something strange home with me. My phone buzzed. It was the rideshare app. A notification asked me to rate my last trip. I stared at my screen, not sure what to put. The man didn't do anything wrong in the literal sense, but the entire ride was unsettling. I ended up giving him 5 stars, mostly because I didn't want to invite any trouble. I put my phone face down on the table, then went to the fridge for some water. I drank half the bottle in a single go. My throat felt dry, and my chest felt tight. Usually, after a weird interaction, I can shake it off. This time, the heaviness stayed. I didn't want to think too hard about it, but my thoughts kept going back. His words repeated in my head. I pictured him stepping out into that dark, empty lot. I tossed and turned for at least an hour before I could fall asleep. The next day, I tried to put it behind me. I had a normal shift at my full-time job, but little moments reminded me of the night before. Anytime I saw someone wearing a hat or walking alone, it triggered that memory. I told a few coworkers about it, but I kept the story short. I said I had a weird passenger who made me uneasy. They just laughed it off, saying that's part of the gig. That evening, I opened my rideshare app again. I looked at the trip history and found the record. The name was there, along with the pickup coordinates. I noticed that the drop-off location didn't match where I stopped. He got out earlier. There was an option to report an issue, but I couldn't think of a specific violation. Nothing technically happened that would go against the rules, except the fact that he picked a strange place to leave. I closed the report screen. My friends sometimes tell me stories about picking up passengers at clubs or bars, dealing with drunks, or even getting stiffed on tips. But this situation felt different. It wasn't about money or safety in the usual sense. It was more like he didn't belong there or anywhere. The memory gave me a chill that I couldn't explain. Over the next week, I drove a few nights to see if I could shake the feeling. Most of my rides were normal people heading home from work or going to late-night hangouts. But every time I accepted a trip, I felt a quick jolt of anxiety. What if I got another passenger like him? What if I had to pick someone up from another dark, deserted stretch of road? One time, I did accept a pickup in a less populated area, and as soon as I arrived, I was reminded of that night. But the passenger was a woman heading to a relative's house. She was friendly, and the ride was uneventful. Still, my heart beat a little faster when I pulled up to her location. I realized that experience had changed the way I view my side job. I now think twice about going too far from well-lit city streets late at night. I still need the extra cash, but I pay closer attention to where I'm heading. If I see a pickup that feels too remote, I hesitate. Sometimes I let it pass, telling myself it's not worth it. Even now, I can still picture that man's outline. Tall, hat casting a shadow, standing alone on a road with no lights. I can still hear his soft voice as he mumbled in the back seat. Words I couldn't make out. And I remember how he looked at me before he shut the door, thanking me and mentioning that he wasn't supposed to stay there. That last phrase sticks with me. I don't know what he meant. Maybe it was just his way of saying he had to keep moving. Or maybe he was on some private journey. I'll never know. But the whole thing rattled me. It reminded me that sometimes we don't get explanations. We just have these moments that make our skin crawl. We do our best to drive away and forget. I still check my rearview mirror a bit more often than I used to. I feel my muscles tense up whenever the roads are empty and the night seems too quiet. Part of me worries I'll see him again, standing in the same way he did that night. Another part of me hopes he's okay wherever he ended up. All I know is that night felt different, and it still does. The memory is sharp, even though nothing dramatic happened on the surface. I dropped him off, he walked away, and that was it. But the silence, the darkness, and his words linger with me even now, making me wonder if there was something else going on that I'll never understand. I've never been the type to scare easily, but something about those sudden bursts of light near the rocks got under my skin the first time I saw them. It was around 6:30 p.m. on a Thursday, and I was finishing my usual kayaking session in that quiet bay. The water was calm and there weren't many boats around. Then, out of nowhere, 2 bright flashes lit up the shore. They were quick and intense, like a camera going off. I glanced around for another kayak or a motorboat, but I didn't see anyone. I shrugged it off then, figuring it had to be some reflection or maybe a weird electrical phenomenon. That's how it all started, simple and shrug-worthy. But after a few more outings, I realized it wasn't going away. My routine remained the same for the next couple of weeks. Every afternoon, I'd drive about 40 minutes from my city to that secluded part of the coastline. I liked it there because it was quiet, and the water stayed mostly smooth. The drive itself was easy. I'd pass a few farms and a long stretch of open road. No traffic, no fuss. Then I'd reach the rocky shoreline where I always parked. I'd haul my kayak off the truck bed, set it in the water, and paddle out. I didn't see many people on a typical day. Occasionally, I'd spot one or two fishermen. Sometimes I'd see a family walking along the shore, but that was rare. The place had a lonely feeling that I usually enjoyed. One late afternoon, I was about halfway through my session when I caught the flashes again. They came from the same rocky area, close to the shore. This time, I noticed them more clearly. There were 2 quick bursts, then nothing. I paused and scanned the coastline. I tried to see if someone was there, maybe with a mirror or a piece of metal. I didn't see a single figure. I only heard the gentle splash of water against the rocks. That was it. No other boats, no voices. I waited a minute, then continued paddling. By the time I got back to the truck, the sun was setting. I was drying off when I spotted a local fisherman who sometimes showed up around that time. He was sitting on a rock, packing up his gear. I approached him and asked if he had ever noticed weird lights near the rocks. He looked at me, tightened his lips, and said something along the lines of, "Occasionally, people do things out there." Then he went back to sorting his nets like I hadn't asked anything else. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push it. But the way he spoke, it gave me a twinge of unease. People do things out there. That was all he said. And it felt like I was missing a big piece of the story. I started paying closer attention. Every time I went to the bay, I'd keep an eye on that rocky zone, especially around sunset. Sure enough, the flashes would pop up in short bursts. I tried timing them. Sometimes it happened right before the sun dipped below the horizon. Sometimes it was a bit later, when the sky was turning orange and pink. Always the same intensity, 2 bright flickers, one right after the other. The rest of the evening would stay dark and calm. I never managed to see who or what caused them. After a few days of this, I told myself I had to get a closer look. One Sunday, I decided to stay out there until full dusk. The idea made my stomach clench, but I needed to satisfy my curiosity. I loaded up my kayak around 4 p.m. and set out on the water. I paddled leisurely, killing time until sunset. The wind was mild, the waves were small. Everything looked normal. I saw the occasional seabird skimming the surface. Now and then a distant motorboat passed by, but never near those rocks. When the sky started dimming, I positioned myself near the coastline, not far from the rocks. I let the kayak drift. The tide was coming in a bit, causing my kayak to sway gently. The rhythmic motion usually relaxed me, but that day, I felt tightness in my chest. My pulse was a little faster than normal. I tried to stay quiet. I wanted to hear any movement or voices. But all I got was the steady sound of the sea washing up against the shore. Right when the sun was almost gone, I saw it again. 2 bright flashes, low to the ground. They seemed to come from a small inlet between 2 large boulders. There was a narrow space there, maybe a few feet wide. I gripped my paddle, trying not to make noise. My heart thumped hard. Then the flashes stopped. I didn't see any beam of a flashlight or any reflective object afterward. I just saw those bursts and then darkness. I decided to approach. It was hard to balance, but I paddled slowly, aiming the nose of my kayak toward that narrow gap. The noise of water slapping against the rocks echoed around me. It felt colder, even though I knew the temperature hadn't changed much. I reached the spot where I thought the flashes came from. I looked around for any gear, maybe a camera tripod, a lantern, or anything else. The shore there was rocky, with small patches of sand. The boulders were damp and slick with algae. I saw no footprints or tools, no footprints in the sand at all. My breathing grew heavy because I knew what I saw. but there was no sign of anybody. I hovered there a couple of minutes. The sun was now just a sliver on the horizon. The sky was a mix of purple and orange, and the light was fading fast. I felt exposed and jumpy. Every tiny sound made me flinch. A seagull's cry made me jerk my head. A splash a few yards away made me tense my shoulders. I kept expecting a person to pop out or shine a light in my face, but it never happened. Eventually, I backed off, paddling away from the rocks. It wasn't until I was far enough into the open water that I relaxed a bit. I went home that night with an unsettled feeling. My gut told me something was off, but I had no evidence beyond those quick bursts of light. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the urge to go back. I kept replaying the fisherman's vague comment. People do things out there. It played in my head like a warning or maybe a clue. I considered a dozen explanations. Maybe it was a couple of locals hunting for shellfish using signals so they wouldn't attract unwanted attention. Maybe it was some kind of smuggling operation. Maybe it was nothing illegal at all, just some kids messing around with signal mirrors. But each time, I remembered how my chest had tightened, how I had that sharp sense of unease. It felt bigger than a prank. The following weekend, I arrived earlier in the afternoon. I wanted to scout the shoreline in daylight. I walked along the rocks, searching for clues. My boots slipped a few times on the wet surface, but I kept going. At one point, I found a small patch of sand behind a boulder, partially hidden. It looked unremarkable, just some shells and seaweed. No footprints, no trash. The tide washed in and out. I waited there for about 20 minutes, listening. All I heard was the water lapping and an occasional distant gull. Then I walked up the slope to see if there was any trail leading to this spot from inland. I found a narrow path covered in thick brush. It looked unused, with tall grass and some thorny shrubs. I had to push branches aside as I moved. I ended up scratching my forearm on a stiff branch. It stung and I felt blood trickle down a bit. I wiped it off with my sleeve. No sign of tire tracks or footprints. Nothing indicated frequent human activity. Everything looked quiet, almost abandoned. I kayaked again that afternoon, but I didn't see the flashes. That day, the weather was cloudy and it got dark earlier. I hung around the same area, but nothing happened. I felt a sense of relief, but also disappointment. Part of me wanted to see those lights again just to confirm I wasn't imagining things. A few days later, I talked to another local fisherman, an older man who was mending a net by a small shack near the parking area. I asked him straight if he knew anything about lights or signals at the rocky shore. He gave me a blank look. Then he said, "Some folks come by at weird hours. Don't know what they do. They don't bother me, so I don't bother them." He wouldn't say more than that no matter how I prodded. His expression told me not to push further. I took a deep breath and decided I would do one more late stakeout. That next Sunday, I arrived at the bay in the late afternoon again. I paddled slowly, almost aimlessly, waiting for the sunset. Time dragged. My arms felt tired from the slow strokes. The sky was clear, and the breeze was mild. Around 5:30, a motorboat went by in the distance. I heard its engine drone for a while, then fade away. After that, it was dead quiet. I stayed near the rocky area, letting my kayak bob in the water. The sun sank lower, and I felt my chest tighten just anticipating the possibility of those flashes. Right around the same time as before, maybe 6:15 or so, I saw movement on top of one of the rocks. I leaned forward, squinting. The light was low, so all I caught was a dark shape. It looked like a person crouching, but I couldn't see details. My arms tensed. I gripped my paddle, feeling my heart thump harder. Then the shape shifted and vanished behind the rock. I didn't hear footsteps or voices, just the water sloshing. I tried to maneuver my kayak closer without making much noise. My hands felt sweaty and my stomach was in knots. Then it happened. 2 bright bursts of light. They were so intense that I instinctively shut my eyes for a second. When I opened them, I saw the outline of someone slipping behind a boulder. It was definitely a person, no question. I tried to call out. My voice felt strained. I yelled, "Hey!" No answer. I pushed my kayak in that direction. The boat rocked side to side. My thighs and shoulders felt tense, but I kept going. I drifted up close enough to see the wet rocks glistening in the low light. There was nothing. No sign of a flashlight, no reflective device. Just the rocks and a small patch of dark sand. I breathed hard, trying to steady myself. My pulse pounded in my ears. I waited, half expecting someone to jump out. Nobody did. After a minute, I heard a distant splash, like someone diving or wading. I whipped my head around, but only saw ripples moving away from the next cluster of rocks. It seemed whoever was there had slipped into the water and swum off, or maybe moved around the bend. I felt a surge of adrenaline. My muscles felt shaky, and my heart hammered so hard that it hurt. I yelled one more time. "Is anyone there?" Nothing but the gentle hiss of the sea. I stayed there for a good 10 minutes. Finally, I felt my nerves get the better of me. My legs were cramped from staying in the kayak for so long. My mind raced with questions. Who was that? Why the lights? What were they signaling? I had no answers. I was just a guy in a kayak, alone, feeling increasingly vulnerable as the sky went dark. I decided to back off. When I reached my truck, the beach was empty. No other vehicles, no campers, no hikers. I loaded my kayak with shaky arms. My breathing was still ragged from the tension. I glanced out at the sea once more before I got into the driver's seat. The tide had risen enough to cover the lower rocks. A few seagulls squawked in the distance. Everything looked calm, almost peaceful. It was hard to believe what I'd just seen. I drove home with my mind racing. I kept replaying the image of that shape on the rock and the blinding bursts of light. The local fishermen obviously knew something but weren't willing to talk about it. I thought about going to the authorities, but what would I even tell them? I had nothing except my own story. No proof, no photos, no real evidence. It could be smugglers. It could be something else entirely. All I knew was that the place felt uneasy now. There was a tension in the air that went beyond simple curiosity. I haven't gone back for a late session since. I still kayak in that bay because it's the best spot I know. Quiet waters, beautiful surroundings, and usually empty. But I leave before the sun gets too low. Sometimes in the distance I think I catch a flicker of light, but I brush it off and paddle back toward the shore. I've tried to focus on the simple routine I love. The dip of the paddle, the push of the water, the salt air on my face. Yet, whenever I see that rocky stretch of coastline, I feel my chest constrict. My shoulders tense. I'll probably never know what's happening there. Maybe it's a harmless activity. Maybe it's not. But my gut tells me it's best not to find out. As much as I hate leaving a mystery unsolved, I'd rather keep my distance. Those quick flashes and that shadowy figure were enough for me. Sometimes staying safe is better than getting answers. And if there's something going on that needs attention, I trust the locals will handle it, or stay away, like they've been doing all this time. For now, I keep to myself. I still enjoy the bay, but with a little less comfort than before. I focus on my paddling, keep my eyes on the open water, and try not to glance at those rocks too often. I haven't asked the fisherman any more questions, and he hasn't volunteered any information. I guess we have an unspoken understanding now. Some places hide things we don't want to uncover. Those flashes still spark in my memory sometimes, but I let them stay in the background. If they show up again, they'll do so without me watching. I've seen enough. I still feel my stomach tense up when I think about those nights. I never thought I'd find something so unsettling in my own home. I always felt safe here. Now I feel like there's something else in this place that I can't explain. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just getting paranoid, but then I remember the sounds I heard. The keyboard shouldn't have made those noises on its own, yet it did, twice. And both times it happened right before midnight. I live alone in a small house with a dedicated corner for music. I turned a spare area off my living room into a tiny recording studio. It's not fancy. There are foam panels on the walls, a few guitars hanging on hooks, and some cables running across the floor. I keep a digital keyboard in there, plugged into a pair of speakers for easy use. I usually leave the keyboard on standby so I can jump into a quick session if I suddenly feel inspired. That's my routine. I don't like missing an idea when it strikes. About 3 weeks ago, I was in my living room watching TV. It was quiet except for the show I was streaming. No neighbors were making noise. It was around 11:50 p.m. I remember that time because I just checked the clock thinking I should probably head to bed soon. Then I heard these faint piano notes. They weren't coming from the TV. They were muffled but distinct. My ears perked up right away. I paused my show and listened. The sound came again like a short melody or random notes. I couldn't tell if it was somebody playing or something glitching. I got up and walked toward my studio. The door was shut, and I didn't see any light under it. I thought maybe I'd left the keyboard on, and it was going through some demo track. But I've played the demo mode before, and this didn't sound like that. I also remembered leaving the keyboard on standby, not fully powered on. I figured maybe I pressed a button by accident or it was a power surge. I keep the lights in the studio off when I'm not using it, so everything was dark in there. I stepped in and slapped my hand on the wall switch. The overhead light flicked on, and I saw the keyboard's power light blinking. There's a small LED on the power button that flashes when it's turning on or off. It blinked for a second, then went solid. I approached it slowly, like I expected someone to jump out. But there was nobody in the room. My guitars were still hanging on the wall. No one was behind my desk. The place was empty. The only sound I heard was the faint hum of my mini fridge in the corner. I checked the keyboard's display. It was fully powered, set to a standard grand piano voice. I tried to replicate the notes I'd heard, but I couldn't remember exactly how they went. It was a quick pattern of maybe 4 or 5 notes. The volume was turned down to a moderate level. Nothing looked out of place. I checked the cables. They were all in the right spots, not loose. I sat on the stool and pressed a few keys. The sound was normal, nothing strange. My heart was pounding a little, but I told myself it was probably just a random glitch, maybe a voltage spike. But everything else in the house was fine. None of my lights had flickered. My TV was still on, paused. That didn't make sense. Usually, if there's a surge, I'd see some sign of it elsewhere. I decided to shut the keyboard down completely. I pressed the power button and watched the screen go dark. Then I turned off my audio interface and the speakers, making sure everything was off. I left the studio and closed the door behind me, double-checking the handle. Then I went back to my living room. I tried to focus on the show again, but I couldn't get the sound out of my mind. It wasn't the first time I'd had technical issues, but this felt different. It felt like someone was playing just a few feet away, even though I was the only person in the house. I ended up going to bed around 1 a.m. that night, still thinking about it. The next day, I told a buddy about it. He said maybe it was the keyboard's built-in system glitching, or maybe a short circuit somewhere in the power strip. That made sense on a technical level, so I didn't feel too worried. But I still got a weird feeling recalling how it sounded. It wasn't random enough to be a glitch. It felt like someone casually hitting a few keys just to test them. But I let it go. I didn't hear anything for a while. A week later, on a Thursday night, I was in the same spot on my couch. It was around 11:45 p.m. I remember the time because I was about to check if I had any emails to answer before heading to bed. Suddenly, I heard the notes again. This time they were louder. They carried through the wall with more clarity, like someone turned up the volume. I jumped up, adrenaline kicking in. I switched off the TV and stood still for a moment. My heart pounded. Then I heard the notes again, about 6 or 7 this time, almost like a short scale or a few random chords. I rushed to the studio door. It was closed, just like before. I yanked it open, and the room was dark. The overhead light was off. The air felt still. I saw the keyboard's LED power indicator blinking again. This time, the speakers were disconnected. I'd unplugged them earlier in the day to rearrange some cables. There was no reason I should have heard anything from that keyboard. But I did, My eyes darted around the room. Nobody was in there. I hit the wall switch and marched over to the keyboard. I checked the power cord. It was still in the outlet, but the speaker's cables were coiled on the desk. The headphone jack was empty. There was no external amp or monitors connected, yet I'd heard clear piano notes. I pressed the power button to turn it off. The blinking stopped. My chest felt tight. I wasn't shaking, but I felt this tension in my arms and shoulders. I leaned over the desk to look under it just to make sure nothing was hidden or messing with the cables. Everything looked normal. I moved to the window, opened it, and looked outside. It was dark, and the yard was empty. I closed it and locked it. I still felt uneasy. I thought about the chance of a radio interference or some weird wireless signal, but I'd never heard of that coming through a digital keyboard that's turned off at the speakers. Plus, the keyboard was on standby, not fully powered. That standby mode only draws minimal power for the quick start function. It shouldn't be enough to produce sound without an amplifier. I decided to unplug the keyboard completely. I pulled the power cord out of the wall. Then I wound it up and placed it on top of the keyboard. I didn't want any chance of it turning on by itself. I also turned off every piece of equipment in that room. I flicked off the lights and went back to the living room, leaving the studio door open this time. I wanted to hear any possible sounds if they started again. I sat back down, but I didn't bother with the TV. I just waited, eyes on the clock. Midnight came and went, and I heard nothing. I finally went to bed, still uneasy, but I told myself I'd figure it out the next day. The next day I checked the entire keyboard for any weird settings. I looked at the user manual. I even called the manufacturer's support line to ask if they'd ever heard of a device powering itself up and playing random notes without an amp or speakers. The guy on the phone said that wasn't possible unless the keyboard was defective. But I tested it in the afternoon, and everything seemed fine. The keys worked normally. The onboard sounds were all standard. No anomalies. The support rep suggested I try a different outlet or check my wiring. So that evening, I moved the keyboard to a different corner of the room and tried another outlet. I plugged it back in, tested it, powered it down, and left it in standby. That night, I sat in the living room again. The hours passed. I got ready for bed around 11:30 p.m., then sat quietly, waiting. Nothing happened. No strange notes. No blinking lights. I fell asleep on the couch around 1 a.m. When I woke up at 2:30 a.m., the house was silent. I felt a mix of relief and confusion. Maybe the problem was gone. Maybe it was just a fluke. But about a week later, the sound returned. It happened around 11:55 p.m. I was wide awake because I'd been working on some editing for a small project. I had my laptop on the coffee table, and I was wearing a pair of headphones. Then I heard it again, short sequences of piano notes, at least 4 or 5. I jumped up, tossed my headphones aside, and rushed to the studio. This time, before I even entered, I could see a faint glow in the darkness. It was the keyboard's power light flashing. The door was half open, and I was certain I'd left it closed. I walked in. The overhead light was off, but I saw the keyboard's LED go from blinking to steady. Then the notes stopped. I walked straight to the keyboard. My breath felt heavier. My arms were tense. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The power cord was still plugged in, but I remembered unplugging it the other week, so this must have been the new arrangement. I was so freaked out from before that I'd started plugging it in only when I intended to use it. Yet here it was, plugged in again. I tried to recall if I'd used it earlier that day. Maybe I'd forgotten to unplug it afterward. Even then, why was it playing without an amp? The speakers still weren't connected. I looked under the desk. The speaker cables were still coiled up. No headphones were plugged in. I didn't even see the headphone adapter, but I'd heard piano notes as clearly as if the speakers were on. I felt cold sweat on my forehead. I stood there listening. The room was silent again. The overhead light switch was right behind me, but I didn't bother turning it on. I just kept staring at the keyboard. Then I reached out and touched the keys. They responded normally, but there was no sound because there was nothing to output the audio. I pressed the power button. The screen went dark, and the LED blinked once, then turned off completely. I stood there for a minute, half expecting it to turn back on while I was watching. It stayed off. I unplugged the power cord. I set it aside. Then I left the room. I couldn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the times I'd heard those notes. They always happened around the same time, close to midnight. Each time I'd find the keyboard in some powered state, but I'd never see it actually turn on. I'd only see it blinking, as if it was in the process of powering up. And I'd never catch it actually playing, I'd only hear the notes from another room. That was the freakiest part. It's like the sound waited until I wasn't looking. I haven't heard the keyboard play by itself since then, but I still feel uneasy every night around midnight. I've double-checked the house wiring. I replaced the power strip. I keep the keyboard unplugged most of the time. Sometimes I wonder if there's some short in the keyboard's internal board that triggers a self-test or a random power cycle, but I can't explain how I heard notes without speakers. That detail bothers me more than anything else. The last time it happened, I'd made sure the speakers were disconnected, and there were no headphones plugged in. The volume was set to a normal level, but there was no output device. Yet I heard piano notes, as if someone was playing in a quiet but distinct way. I keep asking myself if I'm imagining things, but the sounds were real. They were not in my head. They were loud enough to pull me out of whatever I was doing. It's like the house itself was echoing with piano notes. I'm not jumping to supernatural conclusions, but I don't have any other explanation. I've told a few friends, and they either joke about me having a ghost or they insist it's just a technical problem I haven't figured out. At this point, I've tested everything I can. The keyboard seems fine when I use it. It records properly, the keys respond, all the settings look normal. Now, I just keep it unplugged until I actually need to play it. I've added a small note on a sticky pad near the power outlet reminding me to stay calm. Sometimes I glance at the studio door at night, expecting to see a flicker of light under it, or to hear that short sequence of notes again. But so far, nothing else has happened. I don't know if it will happen again. If it does, I plan to record it on my phone, to have some proof. But part of me doesn't want to hear those notes again. It gave me this feeling in my gut that something wasn't right in my own home. It made me feel like I wasn't alone, and not in a comforting way. So that's where I am now. The keyboard sits in the corner of my studio, disconnected from everything unless I plug it in for a session. There's no sign of a fault, no sign of anything unusual. But I'll never forget those nights when I stood in the dark, listening to something play those random notes. I didn't see anyone. I didn't see anything move. I only heard the sound of piano keys resonating in a room that should have been silent. It still gives me goosebumps. Now, every time I'm up late, I find myself looking at the clock around midnight. I listen carefully, waiting for those notes to come back. And every night I'm relieved when I hear nothing. But I know it happened, and I have no idea why. I never thought I would see footprints that made no sense. I was used to odd surprises in my backyard, fallen branches, broken pieces of gutter, old toys that washed in from somewhere else. But when I went outside that morning, I felt a chill run through my arms that had nothing to do with the leftover drizzle. I saw those long, deep impressions in the mud, and my mind started racing. They weren't mine. They weren't from any regular shoe. They looked like huge bare feet, but with an odd shape I can't fully explain. I stood there staring, and my stomach knotted up. I'll never forget how quiet everything felt as I looked at those marks. That was just the beginning. I live in a one-story house on a decent plot of land. The yard's mostly grass with a fence around it, and there's a simple concrete path leading from the front gate to the back door. It's not fancy, but I like the space. I like being able to have a barbecue on weekends. I like tossing a ball around with my friends when they visit. Nothing dramatic ever happens here. It's usually pretty calm, which is why those footprints caught me off guard. The night before, It had rained like crazy. The weatherman called it a major storm system. The wind whipped around the trees, and it sounded like the sky was tearing open every few minutes. I stayed inside. I didn't look outside much, I just heard the rain pounding on the roof. Occasionally, I peeked out the window. My yard looked like a small lake with water pooling in the corners, and the grass was almost entirely underwater. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I locked all the doors, double-checked the back door, and made sure the windows were secure. I didn't want anything blowing open. Then I tried to get some sleep, but the storm kept waking me up. I'm a light sleeper, so every bolt of lightning made me jolt upright for a second. By morning, the rain had slowed, and I could see some sunlight coming through the blinds. I got up, pulled on a hoodie, slipped on some old sneakers, and decided to go out back. I wanted to see if there was any damage. The grass was still soggy, and water had collected in a few low spots. The air felt heavy and smelled like wet leaves. I saw some scattered branches on the ground and a few pieces of trash that must have blown in from outside. Nothing too dramatic. Then I walked a little farther and noticed something in the softer part of the ground. They were footprints. They sank a few inches deep into the mud, spaced as though someone had walked carefully across the yard. But the shape was weird. Instead of a shoe outline, each print looked like a large, elongated foot. The toes weren't that defined, but I could see something that looked like an arch and a heel, bigger than mine by at least a couple of inches in length. My first thought was that someone had trespassed. But why would someone walk around my yard barefoot in the middle of a storm? I bent down to look closer. My heart thumped faster. I realized I couldn't see the tread of a sneaker or boot, and that made me uneasy. I could feel my breath tightening in my chest. There was a fresh smell of damp dirt in the air, and the prints glistened. They hadn't dried yet. It meant they were probably made after the storm had mostly passed, or at least when the rain started letting up. I stood up and scanned the yard. I didn't see any sign of a person. No coat or bag left behind. No footprints leaving through the gate. Then I checked the fence line. No visible damage. It wasn't knocked down or bent. I walked along the trail of footprints. They led from near the back fence toward the center of my yard, then stopped. Literally stopped. They didn't turn around. They didn't veer off. They just ended in the middle of the grass. I stood there, scratching my head, trying to figure out how that made sense. I looked in every direction for more footprints, but there was nothing. It looked as though the person had either stepped into a helicopter or had been picked up by something. But that idea sounded crazy. I felt a knot form in my gut. I rubbed my hands together, trying to stay calm. I decided to check around the house. Maybe the intruder walked around the side or tried to get into a window. But the ground on the sides of the house was also muddy, and I didn't see any footprints there. When I reached the back door, I noticed no scuffs or forced entry. I turned the handle. Locked, just like I left it. The windows were intact and nothing was broken. I felt a mix of relief and confusion. How could someone leave footprints and vanish like that? I went back inside. I set my shoes by the door because they were caked in mud, and then stood in the kitchen, thinking about what to do. My mouth felt dry, and I noticed my hands were shaking slightly. I poured a glass of water, but I could barely swallow. My mind was locked on those footprints. Who made them? Could it have been an animal? That didn't seem right. The shape and size seemed more human than animal. Could someone have used really weird shoes that mimic feet? I thought about it for a second, but I couldn't think of a reason for that. Plus, the prints looked too natural, like an actual foot sinking into the mud. I decided to grab my phone and take a few pictures for proof. I didn't want to ask for help without something to show. So I went back outside, snapping a few shots from different angles. I tried to put my foot next to one of the prints to compare the size. It was definitely larger. I felt uneasy just seeing the difference. Something about it made my skin crawl. It was like standing next to a puzzle I couldn't solve. I kept waiting for some logical explanation to pop into my head, but nothing made sense. After I took the pictures, I texted a friend of mine, Mark, who lives a few blocks away. I explained the situation briefly and asked if he'd come over. Mark is usually level-headed and good at figuring out problems. He also knows a bit about tracking from his time going camping a lot. About an hour later, he showed up with his truck. He came through the front gate, gave me a nod, and asked to see the footprints right away. I led him around back. He whistled when he saw them. He knelt down and pressed his fingers into the mud near one of the prints. I watched him check the depth and the distance between steps. He stood up and looked around. He walked along the prints, stopping where they ended. He rubbed the back of his neck. Then he turned to me. "This is weird," he said. "They're deeper than I would expect if it was a kid messing around, but maybe it's a grown adult pulling a prank." He didn't sound convinced. "The shape is really odd, and I don't see any exit prints. It's like they disappeared." I nodded and felt my throat tighten again. "That's what I thought. There's no sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone climbing out. They're just gone." Mark took out his phone and snapped some photos as well. Then he walked around the perimeter of the yard, checking the fence for gaps or loose boards. Nothing. He even looked for footprints outside the fence on the other side, but everything there was mostly dried up and we didn't see any tracks. We checked a few of the puddles, but only saw random debris and some silt. "This is bizarre," Mark said, coming back to stand next to me. "I can't see how someone just vanished. Did you hear anything last night? Any noise?" I shook my head. "Only the storm. And that was loud, so maybe I missed something, but I didn't hear voices or gates opening." He nodded. "Me neither. The storm woke me up too, but I just heard rain and thunder." We stood in silence for a while. My stomach kept twisting. My heart pounded. I felt a weird sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching us. I glanced around, but no one was there. The neighboring houses were quiet. I couldn't hear any dogs barking or see any curious faces peering over the fence. We went back inside. I offered Mark a beer, but he declined. I poured myself one anyway. I just needed something to hold. I couldn't stop looking out the kitchen window toward the spot where those footprints ended. Mark leaned against the wall and folded his arms. He asked if I wanted to call the police. I thought about it, but decided against it. I didn't have any evidence of a crime. There was no broken window or stolen property. It was just weird footprints. The police might not do anything about that. Mark hung around for another 30 minutes. We talked over different possibilities. Maybe someone used a ladder to climb out, but we saw no marks of a ladder. Maybe they wore big novelty feet to freak me out. But who would do that in the middle of a storm? None of it sounded right. Eventually, Mark said he needed to head home. He told me to call if anything else happened. Then he left. I spent the rest of the day feeling on edge. I kept staring at those footprints through the window. They started to lose shape as the sun dried the mud, but the memory of them stayed clear in my mind. I locked all the doors again. I made sure the windows were shut tight. I double-checked the fence. Everything looked normal aside from those strange impressions. By evening, I tried to move on with my day. I watched TV for a while, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the yard. Around 9 p.m., I turned on the back porch light and looked outside. The footprints were still visible, just more cracked around the edges. I stood there in the doorway, feeling the night air on my face. The sky was clear now, with a few stars peeking through. I listened for any sound, footsteps, rustling, anything. But I heard nothing except my own breathing. Before bed, I did one more check around the property. My footsteps sounded crunchier on the drying grass. I had a flashlight in one hand, just in case. The beam lit up the fence, the ground, the corners of the yard. I saw no fresh footprints. I felt a slight breeze on my arms. My heart pounded in my chest. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting something to jump out, but nothing did. Eventually, I went back inside, feeling a little foolish but still uneasy. That night, I slept lightly. Every time the house creaked, I woke up. I listened intently, hoping it was just the wind or the house settling. I tried to calm my breathing. My chest felt tight. My stomach churned a bit. and I couldn't stop thinking about those prints. Eventually, I drifted off, but my sleep was restless. In the morning, I went outside again. The muddy ground had hardened, leaving faint outlines of the footprints. They weren't as detailed as before, but they were still there. I walked around, hoping maybe I'd find something I missed, a piece of torn clothing, a dropped wallet, anything. I found nothing new. I felt my jaw clench. I realized I had no real answers. For the next few days, I kept checking the yard. I even asked a neighbor if they'd seen anything strange. They said no. They'd heard the storm, of course, but they didn't notice any late-night commotion. It became a kind of obsession for me. I'd look out the window multiple times a day. I kept expecting to see more footprints or someone creeping around, but it stayed quiet. It's been a while now, and I still have no explanation. The footprints eventually faded away as the grass grew back. But I can't shake the feeling that something odd happened. I never found any clue about how those tracks ended. I never found out who or what made them. Sometimes, especially after a heavy rain, I go outside first thing in the morning. I look for more of those strange prints. I check every corner of my yard. I stare at the fence line, waiting for a sign. Nothing new has appeared, but when I think about it, I still get that tightness in my chest. The idea of someone or something walking through my yard in the middle of the night and then vanishing into thin air bothers me. I tried to rationalize it. I've tried telling myself it's just a prank or some odd occurrence I can't fully grasp, but part of me remains uneasy. The fact that I never got closure leaves me with a knot in my stomach. And every so often I dream about those prints. I see them in the mud, and in my dream they don't stop halfway. They lead somewhere I can't follow. That's the story. It's just one of those things that happened and left me with more questions than answers. I wish I had a solid conclusion. But all I have are pictures of big, odd footprints that started and ended in my backyard after a stormy night. No explanation, no trail leading away. I haven't been able to solve it, and it still makes me look over my shoulder whenever I step outside, especially on rainy days. I always believed waiting for the last bus was just an annoying part of my routine. I used to think it was an acceptable trade-off for the overtime pay. That changed the night I first heard those voices. It was past midnight, and I was dead tired. My body ached from standing all day, and my eyes burned from staring at a computer screen. There was nothing romantic about that bus stop. It was a concrete structure with a slab overhead that offered slight shelter. The street lamp nearby had been out for weeks, so it was dark. The only light came from distant headlights every now and then, or the faint glow of a liquor store sign far down the block. I remember sitting there, rubbing my neck, waiting for a bus that was supposed to arrive in another 30 minutes. There wasn't much to do except check my phone or stare at the empty street. I kept glancing at the dark sidewalk. There was some trash on the ground, an empty coffee cup and a soda bottle. The graffiti on the wall behind the bench was old and faded. The night was calm, but the darkness made me uneasy. I tried not to think too much about it. I just needed to get home. That was when I heard it. It was low, and it sounded like a conversation. It came from behind the concrete wall that curved around the back of the bench. At first, I thought maybe a couple was standing there whispering. I paused, turned my head, and listened. I heard some low mumbling. Then there was a faint laugh, or maybe a scoff. The air felt colder, but I didn't see anyone. My skin prickled. My scalp tightened. I got up and walked around the side of the structure to check. Nobody was there. I stood still for a moment, my heart pounding. I couldn't see anything except the street behind me. The sidewalk was empty in both directions. No cars were passing by at that moment. The nearest building was closed, and its lights were off. I felt like an idiot because I was sure I had heard something. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Sometimes when I'm tired, random noises sound louder than they are. I went back to the bench and sat down again. After maybe 5 minutes, the whispers started once more. This time it wasn't just a single voice. I swear I heard at least 2 distinct tones. One was deeper, and the other was lighter. They overlapped in a quick exchange. I couldn't make out the words. It all sounded garbled, as if they were just below the level of normal speech. I tilted my head and tried to focus, but it didn't become any clearer. My pulse picked up speed. My mouth went dry. I tried to ignore it, but it got under my skin. I stood up again. My legs were tense. I walked slowly around the wall, one hand out, prepared to tap someone on the shoulder if they were crouching or something. When I reached the back, there was nothing there. No people, no sign of movement. The alley behind the bus stop was empty and dark. I shone my phone's flashlight around, but all I found was some old litter and a battered cardboard box. I started feeling stupid again. I double-checked the time on my phone. It was past 1 a.m. by then. I just wanted my bus to show up. I returned to the bench for a second time, feeling unsettled. My skin felt clammy. I kept my phone in my hand, ready to call someone if I needed to. The air around me was still. The night was quiet except for those faint whispers. I tried to figure out a logical explanation. Maybe it was a small radio left somewhere. Maybe it was the wind carrying voices from a distant apartment window. But the sound seemed too close. I focused on my breathing for a moment, inhaling through my nose and exhaling slowly. My heart was thumping, and I could feel a slight tremor in my hands. I slid my phone into my jacket pocket and forced myself to lean back against the bench. The smell of concrete dust and stale urine wafted up from the ground. I felt uncomfortable. Every time I turned my head, I expected to see someone creeping up behind me. I heard that low mumbling again. It was like they were having a private conversation, just out of reach. My shoulders tensed, my arms felt stiff. My eyes darted from side to side, looking for a silhouette or any sign of movement. Still nothing. Then I heard that short laugh or snicker again. My stomach dropped. I couldn't help but imagine 2 people right behind that wall, somehow invisible, mocking me. I know that sounds ridiculous, but in the moment, it felt real. I got up once more annoyed than scared. I walked a little farther this time, checking the sidewalk and the alley. Nobody. I kicked a piece of broken asphalt and muttered to myself. Maybe I was losing it. I was sleep deprived, and I had worked extra hours. My brain could have been playing tricks. That thought didn't calm me down, though. I felt like I was in a place I shouldn't be. The air was heavy and the night felt too silent, except for those occasional voices. I decided to stand instead of sitting. I leaned against the bus stop's outer wall, keeping my eyes on the street. Cars passed occasionally. A taxi slowed down once, probably checking if I needed a ride. I considered flagging it down, but I was short on cash, and I didn't want to blow my overtime pay on a taxi ride. So I stayed put, waiting for that last bus. The voices resumed after a short silence. This time they sounded more urgent. I heard low muttering and quick interjections. I couldn't pick out any words. It was like hearing a conversation in a language I didn't understand. The tone seemed agitated, or at least faster. My ears strained to catch every syllable. A chill spread from my neck down my back. My skin tingled, and my breath caught in my throat. I turned and pressed my back against the cold concrete, looking over my shoulder. It was too dark to see anything behind me. The single overhead fixture at the bus stop didn't work, so the only illumination was from passing headlights or the faint neon sign of that liquor store. I clenched my fists to steady myself. My gut told me something was off. There was no reason for any voices to come from that wall, especially voices I couldn't pinpoint. I decided to check the time again. The bus was now 5 minutes overdue. My phone battery was at 20%. I felt my frustration mix with fear. I wanted to call someone just to talk, maybe a buddy or a family member, but it was late, and I didn't want to wake anyone. I stood there, shifting my weight from one foot to the other, tapping my phone against my thigh. I glanced at the street, hoping to see the bus's headlights. Nothing. The road was empty. The wind picked up slightly, rustling some plastic bags on the sidewalk. The temperature felt like it dropped a couple of degrees. My lips were dry, and my tongue felt thick. I was thirsty, but there was no place open nearby except maybe that liquor store across the street. I didn't feel comfortable leaving the stop, though. If the bus came and I missed it, I'd be stuck there until morning. The voices behind me grew quieter, as if they sensed my tension. Then the laughter came again, the same soft chuckle. It lasted only a second or two, but it made my neck hair stand on end. My mind raced. Who was laughing? Were they watching me? Were they messing with me on purpose? I reached around with my hand, half expecting to brush against someone's face. I touched nothing but the rough concrete wall. My eyes stung from straining in the darkness. I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight. My heart pounded like a hammer in my chest. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple despite the cool air. A minute later, a car turned onto the street, shining its headlights across the bus stop. I took the opportunity to examine the area behind the bench as the light swept past. It was empty. There was no one. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. My anxiety only grew. If there was nobody there, then what the hell was I hearing? Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I saw the bus's headlights in the distance. It approached slowly, as if it was taking its time. I exhaled in relief. The bus pulled up, and the doors opened with a hiss. The driver didn't say much, just gave me a nod. I climbed in, paid my fare, and took a seat near the front. My body felt weak. I leaned my head against the window, letting out a long breath. The bus was almost empty. There was an older man dozing off a few seats behind me, and a woman in the very back reading something on her phone. The overhead lights buzzed slightly. I stared out at the dark street as we pulled away. My reflection in the window looked pale and tense. I tried to forget about the voices. I tried to tell myself I was just exhausted. But I knew something odd had happened. That was the first incident. The next few nights were normal. I caught an earlier bus and didn't have to wait. But another week passed and I worked overtime again. I ended up at that same bus stop at the same late hour. The street lamp was still busted, and the shelter was still the same run-down piece of concrete. The night was cool and quiet. I felt a familiar unease as I approached. I sat on the bench and tried not to look behind me. For about 10 minutes, everything was still. Then I heard that whisper again. It was a single voice this time, a low murmur. My face tightened and my pulse started racing. I got to my feet and stood with my back against the sidewalk, facing the wall. The voice sounded slightly louder this time. It was still muffled, but it felt more distinct. My ears caught a single word or two, but I couldn't make sense of them. It was like syllables from a language I'd never heard before. I moved closer, pressing my ear against the concrete. The surface felt cold. The texture was rough. The whisper continued, and then it paused. I waited, barely breathing. I felt a slight vibration in the wall, or maybe that was just my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I clenched my jaw. I took a step back and looked around the side. Again, nothing. I thought I might see a crack or some vent that was letting sound through, but the concrete was solid. I stepped away, returning to the bench. My body felt shaky. My calves were tense, and my shoulders felt tight. I stared at the street, willing the bus to show up faster. The voice resumed, and this time it was joined by another. I felt my legs weaken. My arms stiffened at my sides. My breath became shallow. They were whispering back and forth again. Every so often I heard that faint laugh. I tried to open my phone's camera and record. My hands were trembling. I hit record and pointed the phone at the wall, then realized it was pitch black. The camera was just picking up darkness. The voices were too quiet for the phone's microphone to capture anything. I replayed the video on the spot, but there was nothing but static and the faint hum of passing traffic. My stomach turned. I was both disappointed and relieved. Part of me wanted proof, but another part was afraid of capturing something I couldn't explain. My phone's battery indicator blinked at 10%. I shut off the screen to conserve power. I stood there, crossing my arms over my chest. My breath felt shallow, and my skin was damp with sweat. The bus was supposed to arrive in a few minutes, but I had no faith in the schedule anymore. I checked my surroundings, scanning for any sign of a person who might be talking. There was nobody. The street was deserted except for me. Then I heard a slight scraping sound, like something being dragged across the concrete. It came from behind the wall. I froze. My chest tightened. My eyes watered from not blinking. I didn't move. The scraping stopped and the whispers began again. I felt goosebumps erupt on my arms. My heart thudded so hard I thought my ribs might crack. I forced myself to step forward. I walked around the structure one more time, using my phone's flashlight to examine every corner. There was just concrete and some trash. I kicked an empty box aside. The scraping sound didn't happen again. I returned to the bench and watched the street. After a few more minutes of that unsettling whispering, the bus finally appeared. I flagged it down the moment I saw the headlights. The driver seemed half asleep. I got on, sat in the front again, and tried to control my breathing. The ride home felt long. My body was stiff, and I kept replaying the sounds in my head. Now it's become something I dread every time I have to work late. That abandoned bus stop is the only covered shelter on that route. I have nowhere else to stand during the long wait. Each time I end up there, I hope that somehow the voices won't return, but they always do. Sometimes they're light whispers. Sometimes they're more urgent. Sometimes there's laughter. I've never found the source, and I never see anyone, but I feel them. I can't explain it. I don't have a theory, and I don't bother guessing anymore. All I know is that when I sit on that concrete bench in the dead of night, something speaks behind that wall. I hear it. It's clear and unsettling. It makes the hair on my arms stand up, and it tightens my chest in a way I can't ignore. I keep going back because I have no choice. I need the job, and that's the only bus home at that hour. So I wait. I listen. I endure it. And every time I leave, I feel the weight of that stop lingering with me. I sit on the bus staring out the window, wondering if I'm just tired or losing my mind. But I know what I've heard. I can't unhear it. That's the truth about my late nights now. I've learned to accept it, even if it keeps me on edge until morning. I still hope they'll fix that street lamp and maybe clean up the bus stop, but until then it remains dark and empty. And I remain stuck with those voices that never show themselves, never explain themselves, and never leave me alone in that long stretch of night. I keep getting these calls in the middle of the night. My phone buzzes at 3 a.m., and the voice on the line always says the same thing. Alarm triggered, possible break-in. I grab my keys and rush out. It's been happening on and off for the past few weeks. The first time I expected to find shattered glass or an open back door, but there was nothing. Everything was locked and still. It's starting to wear me down, and I'm not sure how much longer I can deal with it. That's what's on my mind right now, as I stand here alone in this cramped office, staring at a blinking control panel that won't give me any answers. I manage a small clothing store in a local shopping gallery. It's not the biggest place, and it's not the busiest, but it's mine to look after. Every evening I lock up at 8 p.m. sharp. I turn off the lights, I make sure the registers are empty, and I check every corner for anything that might set off the motion detectors. Then I arm the alarm system and leave. I do the same routine every single night. It's mechanical. Doors, windows, sensors, alarm. That's how it goes. Everything was fine for the first few months. Quiet nights, no false alerts. But about a month ago, the alarm started going off at random times, usually deep in the night. I'd get the phone call from the alarm company. They'd tell me there's movement detected near the middle aisle or near the staff corridor. When I arrive, the security guard from the gallery meets me. His name is Eduardo. He's usually on the overnight shift. He holds a big flashlight, and he's got these wide eyes like he's expecting trouble any second. We check the locks together. The front entrance is always sealed, the back door is locked from the inside, and the windows are secured. We don't see any damage. We walk around the store, shining our flashlights over racks of shirts, jeans, and jackets. The alarm's control panel is mounted by the employee's entrance near the stockroom. When the alarm triggers, it logs the motion sensor location. The system calls my phone automatically. Then the alarm company calls me right after. The panel always shows the same thing: movement in the corridor that leads from the sales floor to the back office. But that corridor has nothing but smooth walls on each side and a single overhead light. No mannequins, no shelves, no hanging displays. There's nowhere to hide. When we get there, we never see anyone. On the first couple of nights, Eduardo and I thought it might be rodents or maybe a bird that slipped inside, but we didn't find droppings or any nesting material. We didn't smell anything unusual. We went through the stockroom. It's just crates of shirts and boxes of inventory, folded and sealed. We checked the corners for holes or gaps. Nothing. I even called pest control, and they inspected the place. They found no sign of an infestation. Everything was clean. So I hired a technician to test the alarm system. This guy came in with his tools, tested the motion sensor's wiring, tried setting it off with different angles of movement, different distances. He even replaced the sensor to be safe. He said it was all functioning properly. He was sure the system wasn't malfunctioning. I listened to him poke around, check cables, run a few diagnostic programs. At the end, he just shrugged and said, "Maybe it's a fluke, but everything looks good here." I try to stay calm about it, but it's messing with my head. When the phone rings at night, my heart starts hammering. I throw on my jeans, grab my coat, and rush outside. I usually don't even remember the drive, just that I end up in the gallery's parking lot, searching for a spot as close as possible. The security guard meets me, we walk in, and we do the same checks. The store looks fine. The racks are all where I left them. The shelves are neat. The mannequins are facing the same direction. The windows are unbroken. But the alarm log still shows motion in corridor. Then I reset it, lock up again, and leave. By then, I'm too wound up to sleep properly. So I stumble into work the next morning exhausted. I tried leaving extra lights on at night. I turned on the overhead fluorescent in the corridor, thinking maybe the sensor was acting up in the dark. It made no difference. The alarm still went off a few nights later. I checked the camera footage because we do have a small camera pointed at that corridor, but the footage just shows an empty hallway. I see the overhead light. The camera's timestamp hits 2:42 a.m. The sensor goes off at 2:42 a.m. The corridor is empty. There's no shadow, no sign of movement. I see nothing. Then the alarm triggers, and the feed keeps showing the same static shot. Finally, I show up in the video around 3 a.m., checking the doors with Eduardo. That's it. The weirdest part is that sometimes I feel a pressure in my chest when I'm in that back hallway. It's like the air is heavier. There's a faint whir from the central air unit, but it's always there. When I'm alone, it sounds louder. And it's not just the sound that gets me. There's a sense of being watched, even though there's nobody there. I keep telling myself it's just nerves. I'm tired and I'm on edge because I'm not sleeping well, but the feeling doesn't go away. A few nights ago, I got another call at around 2 a.m. I threw on my clothes, drove out in the cold, and met Eduardo. He was finishing a cigarette outside the entrance. I could smell the smoke hanging in the air. We walked in together with me up front. My flashlight beam jumped across shelves of clothing. It felt like the store was holding its breath. The overhead lights were off except for the small security lights near the entrance and the corridor. Everything was still. The only sounds were our footsteps on the tiled floor and the distant hum of the mall's ventilation. When I got to the corridor, I noticed a slight movement at the far end. It was quick, like something darted away. I froze for a second. Eduardo stepped forward, shining his light. We both stood there, aiming our flashlights at the spot. There was nothing. Just the closed stockroom door. We opened that door and flicked on the light inside. The stockroom looked normal. Boxes stacked, clothes on metal racks, no one hiding in there. We checked every corner, behind the boxes, under the folding table. Nothing. My pulse was beating in my ears. I felt sweat on my forehead even though it was pretty cold inside. We reset the alarm panel. Then I walked Eduardo out. He locked the gallery entrance behind me. He always does that because the gallery's official closing time is 10 p.m., and I'm the only one with after-hours access to my store. After that, I went back in for one more look by myself. Sometimes I feel braver if I do a final check alone, but this time, I felt uneasy the whole way. The corridor looked the same as always. Clean walls, a plain floor, and a single overhead light. I looked at the blank camera lens pointing right down that space. I felt like I was being observed from somewhere else, though I knew it was just the camera up above. My hands were shaky. I clenched them into fists. I told myself to calm down. After about 2 minutes, I switched off the main lights and left. The next morning, I examined the camera recordings again. I wanted to confirm if I really saw something or if it was just my flashlight beam reflecting. On the footage, I could see myself and Eduardo arrive. The timestamp read 2:18 a.m. Then we moved toward the corridor at 2:19 a.m. There was no flash of movement on camera. I just saw us stop, point our flashlights, and then move forward. There was no figure or shadow. It looked like we were reacting to thin air. I keep hoping the alarm stops going off, but it's not letting up. Last week it happened again on Tuesday, then again on Friday. The store's alarm company called me. They said they were concerned about repeated false alerts and wanted me to check for environmental triggers. I told them I had a technician come out and everything tested fine. They said they understood, but these multiple triggers might affect my insurance coverage. I felt my stomach tighten. I can't afford to have my insurance premiums shoot up because of something I can't even explain. Now I'm trying different approaches to catch whatever is setting off the motion sensor. One night I left a few items of clothing on the corridor floor just scattered around. I hoped I'd see footprints or maybe find something displaced if a person was in there. The alarm triggered at 3:07 a.m. I arrived, looked around, and saw the clothes exactly how I left them. No footprints, no shifts in position. The sensor log confirmed motion in the corridor again, but the clothes told a different story. Nothing had moved an inch. I've also tried turning off the heating and cooling at night, thinking it might be some breeze blowing through. The alarm still went off. I tried adding an extra portable camera on a shelf, angled at the corridor from a slightly different perspective. Same result. The corridor looked empty when the motion sensor triggered. The alarm company is starting to think I'm messing with them, or that I installed a faulty sensor on my own. But I have all the paperwork from the technician verifying the system is okay. One of the last times the alarm went off, I got there within 10 minutes of the call. It was close to 4 a.m., and the gallery was dead silent. I parked near the side entrance, let myself in and found Eduardo in the hallway outside my store. He said, "I heard a thump inside right before you arrived." That made my heart pound. I asked him where, but he said it sounded like it came from the back hallway. We opened the door slowly. The store was dark, and I could barely see the outlines of the clothing racks. The little red light on the alarm panel was blinking, indicating a triggered event. We moved in carefully, shining our flashlights around. As we approached the corridor, I felt a strange chill on my arms. It was colder than the rest of the store. I could see my breath in the flashlight beam. Then I heard a soft shuffle, like something brushing against the wall. We both aimed our lights at the spot. The wall was bare, just cream-colored paint and a power outlet near the bottom. I stepped closer, but I didn't see anything. I heard my own breathing, fast and uneven. Eduardo was silent, but he looked tense. We stood there for a while, maybe a full minute, not moving, not speaking. Then I checked the stockroom. Same as always. No one there. I've noticed that this corridor is always where the alarm gets triggered. It's never the front of the store or the main sales area. It's always that same spot. The only things in the corridor are a small storage cabinet on one side and a fire extinguisher on the other. There's no reason for anyone to hide there because there's no cover. It's just a straight path to the back office. I even taped the cabinet doors shut one night to see if they'd be tampered with. They were never touched. I'm starting to think maybe I need a different kind of help. But I don't know who to call. I don't have proof of an intruder and the cameras keep showing nothing. My insurance company wants an explanation. The security guard is spooked. My employees sometimes tease me during the day. saying the store is haunted, but they stop joking when they see how tired I look. And I am tired. My eyes burn, my muscles ache. I keep dreaming about being stuck in that corridor with the lights flickering, waiting for the sensor to trip. Every night I go through the same closing routine. I check the windows, doors, and motion sensors. I walk the perimeter. I make sure each mannequin is in its place. I even started taking photos before I leave to confirm everything is the same when I come back. But so far the alarm still triggers every so often, maybe once or twice a week at random times, and every time it's the corridor. Every time I rush to the store, find nothing, reset the system, and go home feeling like I'm missing something obvious. I've asked Eduardo what he thinks is going on, and he just shrugs. He says it doesn't make sense to him, but he's certain he's heard something inside the store on nights when the alarm goes off. A faint thump, sometimes a clicking noise, sometimes a shuffle. But we never find the source. He keeps offering to accompany me every time. I'm glad he does, because walking in alone is too unnerving. I'm running out of ideas. The alarm company suggests replacing the entire panel and all the sensors, which is expensive. I might do it anyway, just to see if it helps. I plan to schedule a full replacement next week, but until then I'm stuck responding to these calls. It's been tough on my nerves. My heartbeat races every time my phone rings at night. My girlfriend is worried about me. She sees how jumpy I've become. She asked me if I've considered giving up the store. I told her that's not an option. I can't let some unexplained alarm scare me out of my livelihood. I keep replaying the incidents in my head. The corridor is always the focus. The alarm's log always says, "Motion detected at corridor sensor." The technician found no malfunctions. The security cameras show no intruder. Yet Eduardo and I sometimes hear sounds. Other times I think I see a quick movement. Then it's gone. It feels like I'm chasing shadows. I'm writing this down after returning from another false alarm about an hour ago. I have a dull ache in my temples. I've never been a superstitious guy, but I can't ignore what's happening. There's something triggering that sensor. I don't know if it's mechanical or if there's a hidden explanation I'm not seeing. All I know is I'm tired. My nerves are shot. I want a full night's sleep again. I'll keep trying to solve this. I'll replace the system if that's what it takes. If the alarms continue, I'll have to look deeper. Maybe I'll install more cameras, more lights, or call in someone else to inspect the building. But until I find an answer, I'm stuck in this loop. Phone call in the middle of the night, drive to the store, check the corridor, find nothing. It's a cycle of frustration and tension, and it's wearing me down. That's the reality I'm living in right now. I just hope the next time my phone rings at 3 a.m., I'm prepared for whatever I find or don't find when I walk through that door. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily, but that old hotel in the middle of downtown shook me up. I don't usually believe in anything beyond the ordinary, yet those nights changed my perspective. It wasn't anything dramatic like slamming doors or flickering lights. It was something simpler, whispers in the walls. I heard them clear as day, even though it was after midnight each time. I still think about those sounds and the way they seemed to dig under my skin. I checked out of that place with a lingering feeling that I still can't shake. I arrived on a Monday afternoon for a work trip that was supposed to last 3 nights. The city had a couple of newer hotels, but the company booked me into this historic one in the center of town. At first glance, the place looked impressive. The lobby had thick wooden columns and a reception desk that seemed older than my grandfather. The lobby was dimly lit, though, and the floors creaked under my shoes. I remember the echo of my steps as I pulled my suitcase across the worn carpet. The receptionist greeted me in a polite, quiet voice and handed me a brass key attached to a heavy keychain with the room number stamped on it. There was no electronic key card, just this old-fashioned key that jingled whenever I moved my hand. I took the tiny elevator up to the 4th floor. The hallway there smelled like old books and furniture polish. The walls had wallpaper with a faded pattern of some kind of vines or leaves, and the ceiling lamps gave off a soft, warm glow. My room was at the very end of the corridor. The door itself was thick wood, and the doorknob looked like it belonged in a museum. I turned the key, felt the lock click, and stepped in. Immediately, I noticed how high the ceiling was. There were tall windows, their frames painted in a dull white color that had chipped in places. The bed looked comfortable enough, if a bit old, with a large wooden headboard carved in a style I don't see much anymore. I set my bag down and walked around. The walls were a faded beige. The furniture included a wooden desk, a small armchair by the window, and a tall wardrobe that took up most of one corner. The floors were hardwood, but an area rug covered the space by the bed. Everything felt sturdy yet worn. I unpacked just enough for the next day, a couple of shirts, pants, and toiletries. I tested the Wi-Fi, which worked fine. Then I left for a dinner meeting, thinking nothing of the room's slightly eerie vibe. It was later that night, around midnight, when I first heard the whispers. I remember lying in bed trying to fall asleep. The city noise was minimal, as the windows were thick and shut tight. At first, I thought I heard a muffled voice outside the door. I sat up slightly and listened. Nothing came from the hallway. Then I heard what sounded like faint murmuring coming from within the walls. I sat there, blinking, trying to figure out the source. It resembled a low conversation that I couldn't make out. I couldn't tell if it was a couple arguing or just a radio left on somewhere. I got out of bed, walked over to the window, and looked outside. The street was mostly deserted. 2 street lights cast yellow circles on the sidewalk, and I didn't see anyone passing by. So I shut the curtains again, turned off the lamp, and tried to ignore the noise. But it kept going. These low voices that never formed actual words. I found it impossible to fully relax, so I slid my pillow closer to the wall, thinking I might hear something more distinct. It sounded like a random hum, rising and falling at intervals. Then around 3 a.m., everything went dead silent. It wasn't gradual. It stopped all at once, as if someone flicked off a switch. The next morning, I felt groggy. My meeting started early, so I only had time to shower, grab coffee from the lobby, and head out. I noticed no one else talking about weird noises or anything like that. The staff was polite and professional, and I saw a few other guests in suits like mine. I told myself maybe the pipes in the walls were acting up, or maybe it was the HVAC system in that ancient building. I planned to mention it to the front desk if it happened again. The second night, after a long day of presentations and discussions, I returned to my room around 10 p.m. I felt hungry, so I ordered a sandwich from room service. It arrived in about 20 minutes, delivered by a young guy who looked half asleep. He placed the plate on the desk and I signed the bill. I asked him casually if the hotel had any known plumbing problems. He shrugged and said not that he knew of, and left. I ate in silence, then turned on the TV for a bit. The channels were local news, some reality shows, and old sitcoms. By midnight, I decided to turn in. Lying in bed, I waited to see if the whispers would start again. At first, there was nothing except the distant hum of the building's heating system. My eyelids got heavy, and I started to think maybe the night before was just my imagination. Then it began. The same low murmuring coming from somewhere behind the wall near the headboard. This time my heart started to race because I recognized the pattern. It rose and fell, like a one-sided conversation. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to catch actual words. All I got was a hushed tone, like 2 or 3 voices talking at once but never forming a sentence I could understand. I felt sweat on my forehead. My hands felt shaky. I slid off the bed, crouched by the wall, and listened more carefully. It was definitely inside the wall. I knocked lightly, hoping that if it were a neighbor in the adjoining room, they might respond. No change. The voices kept going. I felt my stomach tighten. I felt my breathing get shallow. It seemed too clear to be water running through pipes or just wind. I was wide awake now, too uneasy to lie back down. I glanced at the time on my phone. It was about 1:15 a.m. I stayed there sitting on the edge of the bed listening. Sometimes the murmurs faded, then came back a few minutes later. I felt a need to do something. I walked into the hallway. It was empty, the lights overhead flickering slightly. I went to the room next door and listened at the door. I heard nothing. No TV, no music, no voices. I went back to my room. The moment I closed the door, I heard the whispers again, just as strong as before. It gave me a chill like I'd stepped into a zone of weirdness. I decided to wait it out. I sat there, fully clothed, leaning against the headboard, feeling my pulse in my throat. I kept checking my phone. Then, at 3 a.m. on the dot, the voices stopped, just like the night before. Complete silence. I slept a few hours, but it was restless sleep. The next morning, I was dead tired. At breakfast, I considered telling one of the staff at the front desk, but I worried they'd think I was crazy. Instead, I tried to handle my work as usual, forcing myself to focus on the meetings. Inside, I kept replaying those sounds. They felt too consistent to be random noises. Every time I thought about it, my skin prickled. That afternoon, I approached the front desk. I asked for a room change. I was polite, saying something like, "Hey, I'm not sleeping well. Is it possible to get a different room? Maybe on another floor?" The woman behind the counter nodded, checking availability. She looked up after a minute and said, "We can give you a room in the newer wing for the last night, if that helps." I agreed right away. I didn't explain the whispers to her. I just said my room was too close to some noise. She didn't pry. I had one more night in the old room before moving. I dreaded it, but I had no choice. That night, I ordered takeout and brought it up to my room. I cranked the TV volume a bit to drown out any weird sounds. I tried to keep myself distracted with emails and a movie on my laptop. The hours ticked by slowly. My eyes burned from lack of sleep and tension. Eventually, around midnight, I decided to shut everything off and just see what happened. The whispers started almost right away, like they were waiting for me. This time, it felt closer, like someone pressing their mouth right up against the other side of the wall. It freaked me out. I felt a rush of panic. My throat went dry. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that for a moment, I wasn't sure if I could even hear the whispers over it. I turned on the bedside lamp and stood up, leaning my ear against the wall again. The murmuring continued, a jumble of sounds that had no obvious words. It was constant, as if I'd stumbled on a private conversation that never ended. I considered calling the front desk right then, but I doubted they'd do anything except maybe send a security guard to stand outside my door. I sat back on the bed, legs dangling off the edge, tapping my foot anxiously on the floor. At around 2 a.m., I started pacing around the room. My arms felt tense, and I realized I was breathing quickly. I tried to calm down by taking slow, deep breaths. The sounds rose again, clearer and more insistent. I couldn't handle it anymore. I walked out into the hall, took the stairs down to the lobby, and stood there for a bit, pretending to check out the brochures for city tours. One of the night staff asked if I needed anything, and I said I was just stretching my legs. I knew I wasn't going to get any real rest until 3 a.m. That pattern had already established itself. So I stayed downstairs for a while, flipping through newspapers and quietly chatting with the night staff about local restaurants. By the time I got back to my room, it was closer to 3 a.m. As expected, the voices had stopped. The silence felt thick and heavy. I lay down but only drifted off around 4. I got maybe 3 hours of broken sleep before I had to get up, pack my things, and go to my final work commitments of the trip. The dark circles under my eyes told the whole story. After my meetings ended, I returned to the hotel, checked with the front desk, and got the key for my new room in the newer wing. This area felt different right away. The carpets were newer, the walls freshly painted, and the hallway was better lit. My new room was smaller, but it had modern lamps, a more contemporary bed, and updated furniture. I sat on the bed and listened for any hint of the old building's noises. I heard nothing but the quiet hum of the air conditioning. I got ready for bed that evening with a cautious feeling, half expecting the whispers to follow me. But they didn't. I slept through the night without any strange interruptions. The following morning I checked out. As I turned in my key, I thought about mentioning the whispers to the front desk staff, but decided against it. I just wanted to leave it behind. On the ride to the airport, I kept replaying those nights. wondering if I'd dreamed the whole thing, but I knew I hadn't. The pattern was too real. The fact that it stopped exactly at 3 a.m. was too precise. I couldn't dismiss it as imagination. Even now, months later, I still wonder about that hotel. The building was old, so maybe it was just old pipes or some draft in the walls. Maybe the structure had cracks that let in the wind or something like that. But the clarity of those whispering voices haunts me. Sometimes I question if my mind was just tired, or if there was some hidden quirk in that part of the building. All I know is that it felt very real at the time, and the way it stopped on a schedule makes me shiver whenever I think about it. I've stayed in plenty of hotels since then, but none have given me that same creeping dread. I still get goosebumps remembering those whispers that seem to come from just behind my pillow. Sometimes I think about going back to that city and checking in again, just to see if it would happen. But so far I haven't worked up the nerve. Maybe I never will. I never thought I'd catch myself checking surveillance footage at 3 in the morning, but that's exactly what I did last month. I'd been hearing odd noises around my workshop late at night and finding small things out of place. My manual for a '98 sedan transmission was left open, even though I always shelve it. I noticed shoe prints near my jack stands on a morning when nobody else should have been in there. At first, I figured I just forgot to tidy up before I locked up. But it kept happening. One night I decided enough was enough. I installed a small camera in the corner of the shop, aimed it at the main workbench, and locked up like normal at 6 p.m. The next day, I checked the recording and saw something that made my stomach clench. I'm a straightforward guy. I've been a mechanic since high school and I run my own shop on my property. The building is a few yards behind my house, so it's easy for me to walk back and forth if I ever need a tool at odd hours. Normally I lock up at exactly 6 p.m. and don't come back until the next morning. But sometimes I realize I've forgotten a wrench or a part I need for a repair at home, and I'll walk back around midnight or 1 a.m. When I do, it's usually silent except for a faint hum from the fridge where I keep drinks for my employees. The only light is the motion sensor outside. Inside the shop, I use my phone light or the overhead bulbs if I really need to see something. One night a few weeks ago, I headed into the shop at around 2 a.m. I needed a specific torque wrench for a small job I was doing on my personal car. When I opened the shop door, I noticed my big toolbox was slightly ajar. I'm almost obsessive about closing it. It's a habit from working in busy garages where you don't want anyone tripping over drawers. Inside the box, I spotted a few wrenches shifted out of place. That seemed odd. Then I walked to the workbench on the other side of the shop. A manual was lying open. I know I didn't leave it like that. And there were faint shoe marks that weren't mine. The tread pattern was different. It looked narrower, maybe a half size smaller than I wear. There was no forced entry on the door or the windows. Everything was locked. That got me pretty tense. The next day, I told my 2 employees about it. They swore up and down they weren't coming in late at night. Neither one has any reason to sneak around. They both have keys, but I trust them. Also, they both said they were home with their spouses. They joked that maybe I was mixing up nights, but I knew I wasn't. I shrugged it off and kept working, but something was bugging me. I didn't like the idea of some stranger sneaking in and moving my tools around. A few days later, I installed a small security camera. It's one of those compact models that records in infrared and has motion detection. I aimed it at the bench where I'd found the open manual. I figured if someone came in through the main door, the camera would catch them crossing the shop. I wired it to a simple recorder that I stored in a locked cabinet. Then I waited. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary for a couple of nights. I stopped by late one evening. Everything looked normal. No footprints, no open drawers. Then I skipped going in at night for a while. After about a week, I decided to check the footage just to be safe. Nothing on it. I felt relieved. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe I'd just been careless. But part of me still felt uneasy. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Tuesday. I locked up right on time, at 6 p.m. I went inside my house, ate dinner, and watched some TV. I didn't go back to the shop that night. On Wednesday morning, I walked over at 8 a.m. to get started on a brake job. The moment I stepped in, I noticed something out of place. A small flashlight that I keep in my top drawer was on the bench. I knew I didn't leave it there. My toolbox was closed, but that flashlight had definitely been moved. The next thing I spotted was the security camera's small status light. It was on, so I knew it had been recording. I grabbed the memory card from the recorder and brought it into my office in the corner of the shop. I plugged it into my computer and started playing the footage from midnight to 6 a.m. That's when I saw those weird shadows. The video was grainy, but there was movement in the background. It looked like a blur drifting near the far wall. At first I thought it was a reflection from a passing car, or maybe a bug near the lens. But then I noticed that the movement sometimes crossed directly in front of the bench. I leaned closer to the screen. It was just a dark, shapeless figure, like a wisp of something. Then, at one point, the overhead light inside the shop blinked on for about 3 seconds and then went off. The switch for that light is on the outside of the shop door. Nobody was visible flipping it. I played the footage again. No solid outline, no face, no body. Just that fast-moving shadow and a brief moment of light. My hands started shaking. I'm not someone who spooks easily, but that was not normal. I told my employees. They both watched the video with me. They asked if maybe it was a glitch or a short in the electrical wiring. I checked the wiring later that day. Everything seemed fine. The switch was working normally, and I didn't see any sign of tampering. I tested the camera at night, flipping the switch on and off manually, and the recorded image showed me clearly. My shape was there, no question. I showed up as a person on camera. That wasn't what happened during that weird footage. The only thing on the screen that night was that strange flicker, more like a faint silhouette. It didn't look like me or anyone else. I started double-checking all my locks. I changed the padlocks on the side door just in case. For about a week, nothing unusual happened. I was careful every time I closed the shop, making sure everything was in place. But my nerves were getting to me. I'd get these chills when I turned off the lights at 6 p.m. I'd glance around the shadows near the hoist, expecting to see someone. One night I heard a scraping sound outside while I was finishing up paperwork. I rushed out with a flashlight in hand. Nothing was there. Not a cat, not a person. Just the trees rustling a bit in the wind. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was in my throat. I checked the camera again, but there was nothing that night. Just me stepping outside and shining my flashlight around. I felt a little ridiculous, but I knew something was off. It wasn't my imagination. I was finding small signs every couple of days. A screwdriver left on a stool, footprints near the trash bin, a dirty handprint on the door. The prints didn't match mine. They looked narrower, like maybe a different brand of glove if someone was wearing gloves, or a different shape if it was a bare hand. I touched it carefully. It felt a little sticky, like someone had oil on their palm. The color was darker, possibly grease. I have grease around the shop all the time, but I clean my hands before locking up. Then one evening, after my employees left, I decided to stay late and see if anything would happen. I turned off the lights but stayed inside with only a small lamp in the office. I waited in silence, listening for any sound. The workshop felt eerie. I could hear every little creak in the rafters. My own breathing felt too loud. Around midnight, I got up and walked quietly around the main floor. I checked behind tool cabinets. I looked inside the small closet where we keep cleaning supplies. Everything was normal. The only thing that startled me was a loud clang when I bumped into a loose muffler pipe leaning against a shelf. My nerves were shot. By 2 a.m., I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open, so I locked up and went inside my house. The next morning, I checked the camera footage again. This time I saw myself wandering around, shining my phone's flashlight. That was all. Nothing strange showed up while I was there. After I left, the camera caught nothing until 4:15 a.m. That's when that shadow appeared again. It slipped by the corner of the screen. Then the top drawer of my toolbox opened a few inches on its own. At least that's how it appeared. I leaned in so close to the screen that I almost fell off my chair. The camera lens faced the main bench, so the toolbox was near the edge of the frame. I couldn't see a hand or anything else. But the drawer moved. It opened a little, then shut again. There was a faint clanging sound, like metal bumping metal. Then it was over. The rest of the footage showed nothing but the empty shop. I'm not a believer in anything supernatural. I suspect there's a logical explanation. Maybe there's some advanced trick, like a device interfering with the camera, or someone wearing specialized clothing to avoid detection. But that light switching on and off, along with the drawer opening, keeps me on edge. I keep thinking that if it's a thief, there should be a clear body on camera, or at least a face. Instead, I'm getting these blurry forms. The physical evidence bothers me. I see footprints, but no forced entry. I see greasy handprints that aren't mine. And I find open manuals or tools left out of place. Yet the locks are never broken, and nothing is gone. It's as if someone just wants to mess with me or read my manuals. That doesn't make sense, but I can't ignore it. Last week, I talked to a friend of mine who's an electrician. He inspected the shop's wiring top to bottom. He didn't see any issues. He even replaced the switch on the outside just to be safe. I also had my friend check the camera, but it's working fine. The files show me as a normal person with a clear outline whenever I walk past. So if a real physical person was there, the camera should capture them in the same way. But all I get is that weird shape, almost like it's not fully there. I've thought about staying up all night again, but I can't afford to lose too many nights of sleep. I'm still working my usual hours, and I have responsibilities. I also considered getting a higher-end camera system with multiple angles. I plan to do that soon if this keeps happening. Maybe with more coverage, I'll catch a real figure. If that happens, I'll at least have something more concrete to go on. Right now, I'm trying to keep calm and carry on with my day-to-day work. But I feel uneasy every time I walk into the shop in the morning. I look around to see if anything got moved or tampered with. My stomach tightens if I spot a drawer open an inch or see a manual lying on the bench. My employees seem anxious too. They joke about ghosts, but I can tell they don't like the situation. They lock up early if I'm not around, and they keep glancing at the corners whenever the shop is quieter than usual. I haven't told many other people about it because most folks would think I'm making it up or that I'm just jumpy. But I know what I saw on that footage, and I've seen those footprints in person. I've felt this unsettling sensation in the pit of my stomach whenever I realize a tool is out of place with no good reason. Something is going on. Last night I stayed in my house and resisted the urge to go out there after midnight. I told myself it was better to get some rest. Before bed, I locked all the doors and windows. Then I sat down in the living room with all the lights on, feeling like an idiot. My pulse was racing for no good reason. I drank some water and tried to focus on something else. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch. Around 5 a.m., I woke up. I walked to the workshop as soon as the sun was up. I checked everything. 2 of my socket wrenches were on the floor. They weren't there yesterday. The camera captured them dropping off the bench at around 3 a.m. But again, I didn't see a person. Just a slight shift of a shadow, and then the wrenches clattering down. It was enough to send a chill through me. I'm not sure what to do at this point. I might hire a security guard or stay up every night for a week to see if I can confront whoever's doing this. But the fact that nothing is missing, no major damage is happening, and the person or thing on camera looks like a blur is driving me nuts. Part of me wants to believe there's a simple explanation, like a prank by someone who's really good at messing with cameras. But another part of me sees those lights flicking on without the switch being touched and wonders if I'm in over my head. For now, I'll keep checking the footage each morning. I'll keep the workshop locked up tight. If this escalates, I'll have to involve the police, though I'm not sure what they'd do with weird fuzzy shadows on video. My employees are spooked, but we're all still doing our jobs. I don't plan to shut down the shop unless things get dangerous. Still, every time I walk in there after dark, I feel my heart pounding and my palms sweating. I'm on edge, waiting for another drawer to open by itself or another random shoe print to appear next to my toolbox. I've never been a superstitious person, but I don't have a better explanation for what's happening. That's where things stand right now. I'm not looking for any wild theories, and I'm not trying to scare anybody. I just want a straightforward answer for why my security camera is picking up moving shadows and how one of my lights turned on and off without anyone flipping the switch. Until I figure it out, I'm going to keep the camera rolling, keep an eye on my tools, and hope that I eventually catch a solid clue. If I do, I'll deal with it. But for now, I'm stuck in this weird situation, and it's turning my workshop, the place I usually feel most comfortable, into a place that makes my skin crawl after sundown. I can't explain it, but I can't ignore it either. I still remember the first time I heard the metal clanging. It was about a year ago, around 10:30 at night. I was walking back from the convenience store with a bag of groceries in my right hand and my phone in my left. I wasn't paying much attention to anything, just following my usual route. Then I heard that steady banging, tum-tum, tum-tum, coming from the abandoned construction site beside my apartment building. It stopped the moment I came close to the chain-link fence. I felt a chill rush down my arms and the back of my neck. I looked through the fence, saw only darkness, and stood there wondering if I should say something or just keep going. I left it alone that night, but I kept thinking about it. That's how this all started. I live in a fairly ordinary neighborhood. My apartment building faces a street with a few shops, a pizza place, and a cheap diner that stays open until midnight. Across the street, there's a huge fenced-off area with half-finished towers of concrete. The original company that started building those towers went bankrupt about 5 years ago. All the workers left, and the place got boarded up. Over time, the boards around the site rotted or got pulled down by curious teenagers. Sometimes you see them sneaking in late at night, maybe to take photos or just explore. I never cared much about it, at least not until I heard those sounds. I work a regular day job doing data entry at a dull office in another neighborhood. After I get home, I usually eat something, watch TV for a while, and then head outside for a short walk to clear my head. These walks help me settle my thoughts, especially when I've had a stressful day. For the past year, though, I've felt a creeping sense of unease whenever I walk by that construction site. It isn't anything dramatic or constant. It's just that every time the clock goes past 10, I start to feel a small knot in my gut. I'm always alert now. I look for any movement behind the chain-link fence. Most nights, there's nothing but silence. But if it gets past 10, especially closer to 11, I'll sometimes catch that low, steady noise. Metal striking metal in a slow rhythm. And always the same pattern. Tum-tum, tum-tum. Then it stops the moment I draw near. The second time I heard it, I tried to ignore it. I kept walking and tried to convince myself it was some leftover piece of machinery vibrating or maybe an animal messing around. But it didn't sound random. It was too rhythmic. It was the kind of pattern you'd expect if someone was deliberately hitting something. I got that prickly sensation along my arms. My heart started beating faster and I found myself gripping the fence. I pulled at it a bit, but it didn't budge. At that moment, the noise cut out. I stayed quiet, not even breathing too heavily, listening for any kind of movement. All I got was silence. That feeling of being watched made my chest tighten, so I just turned around and walked home, trying not to run. I was worried someone might be inside, staring right back at me. Over the next few weeks, I didn't hear the noise every single night. It happened sporadically, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, always around the same time. I started timing my walk so I'd pass by a little earlier, hoping I wouldn't run into that sound again. But there were nights I finished something late or got caught up in a phone call, and I'd be walking by at around 10:30 or 11. And there it was again. Tum-tum. Tum-tum. Sometimes I'd pause across the street, crouch down behind a parked car, and just listen. It gave me goosebumps. My forehead would get clammy and my stomach would tighten as I decided whether to get closer. Usually fear won out and I would just move on. One night, though, I was feeling frustrated after a bad day at work. My boss had piled new tasks on me without notice, and I worked overtime without much appreciation. My head was buzzing and I couldn't shake off the tension. I went for my walk around 10:45, still angry. My body felt tense and I was in that mindset where I didn't care about consequences. The noise started right on schedule. Tum-tum, tum-tum. This time, instead of just standing at the fence, I decided to go in through a gap I'd seen on one of my earlier walks. I was sick of the uncertainty. I was sure it was just some random person messing around, and I wanted to confirm it so I could stop freaking out. I slipped through the fence. The gap was wide enough for me to push my shoulders through without too much noise. The ground on the other side was rough, uneven, and strewn with old boards, gravel, and bits of concrete. I could smell wet cement and a faint trace of something stale, like moldy cardboard. The place was dark, but there were broken windows in the unfinished buildings that let in bits of moonlight. I held up my phone to use the flashlight. I kept the beam low, aiming it at the ground. I didn't want to alert anyone. I moved slowly, trying to control my breathing. Every little sound I made seemed too loud. My foot accidentally kicked a loose piece of metal pipe. It clanged against the concrete and I froze. The hammering noise stopped. I turned off my phone's flashlight, hoping whoever was inside might not see me. I crouched behind a crumbling half wall, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. After a few seconds, the hammering started again. Same pattern, a bit fainter, as if it was coming from somewhere deeper in the construction site. I decided to follow the sound. My eyes slowly adjusted to the dark. I could see some pillars, scattered equipment, and a few stacked bricks. The building was incomplete, with open floors and missing walls. Occasionally, I heard the drip of water from some leaky pipes. My shoes crunched on bits of concrete, which sounded deafening to me in the silence. I kept moving until I reached the base of what seemed to be a half-built staircase. The hammering grew louder. Tum-tum, tum-tum. I looked up and realized the sound was coming from an upper floor. I stood there trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told me to leave, but curiosity pushed me forward. I started climbing the stairs, testing each step before putting my full weight on it. Some steps were cracked. Others were covered in debris. The entire structure felt shaky. My stomach churned with nerves. My palms were sweaty. I kept imagining some figure standing at the top of the stairs, waiting. But I saw nothing except dark corners. I reached the second floor, which was just a bare expanse of concrete columns and walls without windows. The hammering was louder. It came from above me, probably on the third or fourth floor. I shone my phone's flashlight around. I saw scraps of wood, a metal barrel, a few rusted tools scattered around. A makeshift ladder led up to a higher level. I could see a big hole in the ceiling where the stairs presumably would have been finished. I climbed the ladder cautiously. It wobbled under my weight and dust rained down as I pulled myself up through the opening. Once I got to the third floor, I spotted a faint light flickering near the far wall. It wasn't strong, like a flashlight. It was more like the short, quick flicker you get when you strike a lighter. I turned off my phone's flashlight again and tried to stay quiet. The hammering went on. Tum-tum, tum-tum. It sounded like it was just around the corner from where I stood. I felt my stomach knot up. My breathing was shallow and my hands were shaking. I thought about turning around and leaving, but I had come this far. I took slow steps, peeking around the corner. I saw a tiny glow, the end of some small flame. It moved a little, then disappeared. I heard the metal-on-metal strikes right after the glow vanished. Tum-tum, tum-tum. My knees felt weak. It sounded too close. I was sure whoever was there might hear my breathing. My heart was pounding so hard it almost hurt. I leaned against the wall, inching my head forward to look into the next area. There was an open space with a few pillars. In the middle of that space, I saw a figure crouched down, their back facing me. They wore dark clothes, maybe a hoodie. I couldn't see their face. They had some sort of long iron rod in one hand. In the other, they held a smaller piece of metal. They were banging them together slowly, in that same pattern, tum-tum, tum-tum. The floor around them had what looked like scattered nails or bits of metal, though I couldn't see clearly in the dim light. I also noticed a small flashlight on the ground, turned off. The only light came from a small lighter they kept flicking on and off. I didn't understand what they were doing. I heard them mutter something under their breath, but I couldn't make out the words. My chest felt tight, and I thought about stepping back. Then, while I was standing there, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was on vibrate, but that sudden noise in the quiet space startled me. My body jerked, and I accidentally kicked a loose piece of rubble. It tumbled forward and clattered across the floor. The figure stopped hammering immediately. I froze. The person stood up, turning slightly. I couldn't see their face, but I felt their eyes trying to find me in the dark. My heart hammered so hard it hurt. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I was stuck between wanting to run and wanting to stay still. The figure stepped in my direction, just one step. That was enough for my body to snap into action. I bolted. I turned around, forgetting the ladder was behind me. I stumbled, almost fell, then managed to catch myself. I scrambled down the ladder, nearly missing the last few rungs. I landed on the second floor with a thud, scraping my knee in the process. Pain shot through my leg, but I kept moving. My foot kicked a piece of rusted rebar, and I heard it clang away. My breath sounded harsh. I rushed toward the staircase, trying not to slip on the debris. Behind me, I heard swift footsteps. It sounded like the person was close. I didn't look back. I practically jumped down the stairs, hitting a cracked step that sent me flying forward. I crashed onto the landing, dropping my phone. It slid across the floor and banged against a wall. I heard a snap from somewhere, but I couldn't tell if it was my phone or some other piece of debris. The footsteps above me grew louder. My adrenaline spiked, and I ignored the pain in my hand. I picked myself up and sprinted toward the gap in the fence. I reached the fence, squeezed through, and nearly tripped over the sidewalk curb. I heard no footsteps behind me anymore, but I didn't stop. I ran 2 blocks before I paused under a streetlight to catch my breath. My lungs burned and my chest felt tight. I checked my phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. My palms were filthy and my left knee was scraped and throbbing. I stood there, looking back in the direction of the construction site. The street was quiet. Everything looked normal. I felt the pounding in my head as I tried to process what I had just seen. That was the only time I actually went inside. After that, I changed my walking route. I avoided passing the site after 10 p.m. The sound still happens sometimes. I've heard it from a distance when I was walking on parallel streets. If I'm up late in my apartment and I open my window, sometimes I can faintly hear that pattern. Tum-tum, tum-tum. It makes my skin crawl. My heart speeds up every time. I don't know why that person is there or what they do in that shell of a building. I don't know if they live there, if they're just some thrill seeker, or if there's something else going on. I've considered calling the police, but I'm not sure what I'd tell them. There's someone hammering metal in an abandoned site. That's not exactly an emergency. And from what I've heard, the cops don't bother much with that place unless they get a report of a serious crime. Still, I can't shake the memory of that figure crouched there, banging metal rods together in the dark. I remember the flicker of that lighter, the small ring of light around their hands, the silent moment when they realized I was watching. I've tried to let it go. I haven't been inside again. Every time I pass by in broad daylight, I look through the fence. I see dirty concrete, rusted scaffolding, broken windows, and graffiti. No sign of anyone. But late at night, that slow pattern of strikes echoes across the street, and I can't help but feel a deep tension in my chest. I think about the way they moved when they heard me, the quick step in my direction. I imagine if I hadn't run, they might have confronted me or chased me further. I don't know what would have happened, and I don't want to find out. So that's the story. There's no dramatic conclusion or neat resolution. The site is still there, half built and rotting away. The night clanging still happens. I still walk at night sometimes, but never along that route when it's late. And every time I catch the faint sound of metal hitting metal, I think about that figure in the darkness, crouched on the concrete, flicking a lighter on and off, waiting. I don't plan on going back inside. Whatever's in there, it doesn't feel right. I'd rather keep my distance no matter how curious I get. If anyone else wants to check it out, they can. I'm done. That place gives me a chill I can't fully describe, and I'm not looking for trouble. I've learned my lesson. I noticed the perfume on a Monday night around 11 o'clock, when I was heading back to the lab after grabbing a soda from the vending machine. The hallway was empty, and most of the lights were off. There was a chemical smell in the air from the lab equipment, but then I caught a sudden burst of strong floral perfume. It made me stop right in front of the locked supply closet. The smell came and went so fast that I wondered if I had imagined it. But I felt a faint headache from the intensity, so I knew it was real. That was 2 months ago. I work in a university chemistry department, and sometimes my schedule runs late. I go to the 24-hour section of the library to look up articles or cross-check data. I'm usually one of the last people in the building at night, aside from the night shift security guard. The campus is quiet after 8 or 9. It's just me, a few cleaning staff, and maybe a couple of other grad students finishing up projects. During the day, there are people everywhere, so nobody notices faint smells or weird noises. But at night, every small detail stands out. About a week after I first smelled that perfume, I caught it again. It was around midnight. I was in the same hallway near the labs and a stairwell that leads to the basement. This time, the smell was stronger. It reminded me of a fresh-cut bouquet, but I tried not to romanticize it in my head. It was just a smell. Floral, overpowering, and gone in a few seconds. I shook my head, wondering if someone had walked by a minute before I arrived, but I hadn't heard any footsteps. The hallway was silent except for the buzz of fluorescent lights. My heart felt a little jumpy. I wasn't scared at that moment, just startled by how abrupt it was. I mentioned it casually to one of my lab partners the next morning. She laughed and suggested maybe it was a new air freshener. She said that sometimes the janitorial staff sets up timed dispensers in the hallways. I shrugged and accepted that explanation. But I noticed that none of the wall-mounted dispensers in that hallway carried any floral scent. Most of them were empty or had that neutral, clean smell. So I dismissed that theory. A few days later, I bumped into the night security guard, Gilberto, near the main entrance. We nodded to each other, and I decided to ask if he had noticed anything unusual. He gave me a curious look and asked me what I meant. I said, "Any strange smells at night, like a strong floral perfume?" The way he stiffened told me I wasn't the first to bring it up. He looked down the hallway behind him for a second, then back at me. He said, "You've smelled it too?" I told him I had. He nodded, then looked at his watch. "Yeah, I pick it up around here sometimes, especially in that corridor by the old labs. Always around the same time, always strong, but never for long." Gilberto explained that he had tried to track it down once or twice. He walked the length of the corridor, checked the bathrooms, glanced into empty classrooms, but never found anyone wearing perfume. He said it gave him an odd feeling in his chest, like it was too concentrated, almost choking him. Then it would vanish. No trace, no lingering scent. I noticed he looked uneasy while talking about it, and that made me feel a little tense. But I managed to laugh it off. I said it was probably some old ventilation duct pushing air from one part of the building to another. Gilberto shrugged and said, "Could be," but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Neither was I. From that point on, I became more aware every time I walked through that corridor. Even if I had headphones on, I would pause the music to listen for footsteps. I never heard any. The lights in most of the building turned off automatically at 9, leaving only dim emergency lights in the non-24-hour sections. My footsteps echoed on the tile, and I kept my phone's flashlight on when I went down certain areas. The perfume smell wouldn't appear every night. Sometimes a week would pass without it. But when it did show up, it was sudden, hitting me with a strong floral burst that made me blink. Then it was gone. It started making me anxious. I felt my pulse quicken every time I walked that hallway alone. I tried to reason that it was just a weird odor from some cleaning agent, or maybe a pipeline carrying scented chemicals. Still, I couldn't shake the unnerving feeling that came with it. One time, around 2 in the morning, I had stayed late analyzing some test results. I stepped out of the lab to stretch my legs. The hallway was dark, and all I heard was the soft hum from the refrigerators and freezers in the labs. I walked down the corridor. Then suddenly, the perfume smell enveloped me. My chest tightened, and I coughed. I turned around, shining my phone's light in every direction. Nothing. My hands felt clammy. My stomach lurched a bit. The smell dissipated in a second or two, and I was left standing there, alone. I felt silly for jumping like that, but my heart was thumping so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. After that night, I started changing my routes when it got past 10. I avoided that corridor if I didn't absolutely need to pass through it. The place unnerved me. I told myself it was just a reaction to stress, but I knew that wasn't the full truth. My curiosity was still there, and I thought about investigating it properly. Maybe I could follow the vents or look at the building's blueprints, but every time I thought about doing that, I remembered how I felt in that hallway. My skin got prickly, and my heart beat faster. I also didn't want to feed into any rumors or scare myself more than necessary. One Thursday, I had to stay late again because I needed to verify some references for a paper. I tried to finish before 10, but time got away from me. By the time I left the library, it was almost midnight. The only way back to the lab was down the main corridor, and the shortest path to the exit was through the hallway where I kept smelling that perfume. I stood at the entrance to that corridor, phone in hand, library books in my backpack, and felt a pit in my stomach. The air was still. The overhead lights were off except for the emergency fixtures that cast a pale glow on the walls. I could see the entire hallway, and there was no one else around. I couldn't even hear Gilberto's footsteps or anything else. I thought about turning back and going the long way around, but I was tired and wanted to get home. I told myself to stop being jumpy. I walked forward, my shoes making dull taps on the floor. About halfway down, I heard a soft rustling sound. It came from somewhere to my left, near a door that led to a small supply room. I stopped. My arms tensed. I pointed my phone's flashlight in that direction. The door was closed. The handle didn't move. I told myself it might be the air system kicking on, or a breeze from an open window somewhere else. I took a step closer and grabbed the handle. Locked. No movement. But at that same moment, the floral perfume hit me. It was stronger than ever. I felt a burning in my nose, almost like the smell was too concentrated. I coughed. I swung my phone around to see if there was any sign of a person. Nothing. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes started watering from the intensity of the scent. I backed away, my back bumping against the opposite wall. The smell vanished again, leaving no trail. I was breathing hard, trying to calm myself. My palms were sweating, and I wiped them on my pants. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, listening for any sound at all. The building was silent. No footsteps, no doors opening, nothing. I decided not to linger. I hurried the rest of the way down the corridor, holding my breath. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. When I reached the end, I jogged up the stairs and out the main entrance. I stepped outside into the cool night air and exhaled. It felt good to be away from that hallway. My hands were shaking, and I had to take a moment to steady myself before heading to my car. Over the next few days, I tried to move on and not dwell on it. I had lab reports, deadlines, and a busy schedule, but it kept gnawing at me. During the day, I sometimes walked that corridor to see if the smell would appear in daylight. It never did. It felt perfectly normal in the morning or afternoon. Just a hallway with plain walls, old lockers, and the usual chemical odors from nearby labs. At night, it turned into something else. I talked to Gilberto again and told him what happened. He listened with a concerned look on his face. He said that sometimes around the same spot, he felt like the air changed in pressure as though someone walked right by him. But he never saw anyone. He also noticed the perfume more around midnight or so. He admitted that it made him uneasy, but he still had to do his rounds, and that corridor was part of his route. He said he got used to it. He'd walk by, smell it, and keep going. I admired his composure. I couldn't imagine just accepting it as part of the routine. He told me he didn't like it, but it was his job to check every hallway. One Saturday night, I decided to stay later than usual, thinking maybe I would see if the perfume appeared again. I didn't have any official reason to stick around, but I wanted to see if there was some pattern. I brought a small notebook and planned to note the time and location if I smelled it. I stayed in the lab until almost 1 in the morning. I was jumpy the whole time, listening for anything unusual. Around 12:45 a.m., I walked down that corridor again, shining my flashlight slowly along the floor and walls. The place was silent except for a faint hum from the exit sign. I reached the spot near the supply closet and waited. Nothing happened. I waited longer, tapping my foot, feeling my heartbeat in my chest. It was boring and tense at the same time. After 15 minutes, I gave up and left. On my way out, I ran into Gilberto, who was doing his rounds. I told him I didn't smell anything. He nodded and said, "It's random. Sometimes it's there, sometimes not." I felt relief wash over me as I headed to the car. No intense perfume that night. For the next few weeks, the smell showed up off and on. Always sudden, always overwhelming, always gone in seconds. Sometimes I only caught a faint trace. Sometimes it was so strong it made me cough. Gilberto also confirmed he kept smelling it. We never found any logical explanation. I considered the possibility of a hidden leak of some chemical that mimicked a floral scent, but I never found any evidence of that in the labs or the building maintenance reports. The cleaning staff had no idea what I was talking about when I asked about new products or fresheners. They said they used the same supplies for years. Now, after 2 months, I still avoid that corridor at night unless I have no choice. The smell unsettles me. The building is large and there may be a normal cause, but I can't ignore the effect it has on me. My chest tightens, my shoulders tense up, and I feel a knot in my stomach. There's no resolution yet. Maybe I'll never know what causes that perfume smell. But the moment I pick up that intense floral note, I just want to get out of there. Even Gilberto, who acts calm about it, admits he's creeped out. We don't talk about it much anymore. We just nod at each other if we happen to pass in that hallway. A few seconds of eye contact, then we keep walking. That's where things stand now. I still do my research in the chemistry lab, and I still use the 24-hour library. But I'm more cautious. I don't like walking alone at night in that part of the building. I keep thinking that maybe one day I'll find out it's some leftover fragrance from a staff member's personal spray or a bizarre quirk in the ventilation system. Until then, it remains an unsettling mystery that hits me at random times, making my heart pound and my lungs feel tight. I can't explain it, and I try not to let it consume me. But I know I'm not imagining it. Gilberto smells it too. It's there, and it's real, and I hope one day we'll figure out why. For now, all I can do is keep my head down, do my work, and avoid that hallway when the lights go off. I never expected to feel real fear in a gym. I've been working out for years and I've seen all kinds of things. People dropping weights, people yelling through their last reps, even a few guys passing out from overdoing it. But I never thought I'd tense up every time I walk past a simple corridor. Now I do. My hands sweat whenever I think about that place and my stomach twists when the clock hits 10 p.m. This is what happened. I've been going to this 24-hour gym for about a year. I work a regular job during the day, and I like to train late at night. After 10 p.m., the place usually clears out. Sometimes there's only a receptionist and maybe 1 or 2 other members. It's perfect for me. I don't have to wait for machines, and I can focus on my workout without distractions. The building has one large main area with treadmills on one side and free weights on the other. There's also a narrow corridor along the far wall. That corridor leads to 2 places, the locker rooms and a room that used to host group classes. The staff no longer uses that classroom for anything. The door is usually closed, and the lights inside are switched off. I never cared about that area until I started hearing something strange. About 2 months ago, I was finishing a set of bench presses. It was around 10:30 p.m., and the gym was quiet. All I could hear was my own breathing and the low hum of the air conditioning. Then I heard footsteps coming from that corridor. They had a very steady rhythm. It wasn't just casual walking, it sounded too deliberate, like someone putting extra force into each step. I thought maybe it was another member heading to the locker room, so I racked my weights, stood up, and glanced around the gym floor. I saw no one. The main area was empty. The treadmills were still, and the only staff member at the reception desk was looking at his phone. But the footsteps continued. They got louder, then softer, then they paused. My heart started racing. I felt my arms tense. I grabbed my water bottle and walked toward the corridor. The light inside that corridor is dull at night. It's not dark, but it's not bright either. I stepped in, trying to see who was there. Nobody. All I heard was the echo of my own steps. The corridor felt colder than the rest of the gym, or maybe that was just my imagination. I checked the locker room door. It was open a crack, lights on inside, but no movement. I pushed the door all the way open. Empty. I checked the other door, the old activity room. Closed. When I put my hand on the doorknob, it felt cool. I slowly turned it, but it was locked. I heard nothing else. I stood there for a moment, my pulse drumming in my ears. I took a deep breath, shook it off, and told myself it must have been some weird echo or something from outside. I went back to my workout. But after that night, I started hearing the footsteps more often. Always around the end of my workout, somewhere between 10 and 11 p.m. They never sounded random. They had a constant pattern like step, 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 each with the same interval between them. At first, I tried to ignore it. I turned up my headphones. I moved to a different part of the gym, but it got under my skin. One night, I was alone, except for the receptionist. I was doing dumbbell rows on the far side of the gym. My music was on low volume because I was tired of blasting my ears. Then I heard those footsteps again. They were loud enough to cut through the low hum of my headphones. My back tightened. I stood up, grabbed my phone, and walked straight to the desk. The receptionist was leaning on the counter, scrolling through something. I said, "Hey, are you hearing that?" He lifted his head. Hearing what? I pointed toward the corridor. Footsteps, strong ones. He sighed and nodded. I hear them sometimes. I've checked a bunch of times. I never see anyone. And there's no sign of the building settling or anything like that. Trust me, I've walked that hall a dozen times. It's always empty. That gave me chills. I expected him to laugh it off, but he was serious. He leaned in close and said, "It's weird, right?" I felt my forehead tighten. Yeah, really weird. From then on, I got more anxious every night. I started finishing my workout earlier, around 9:30, just to avoid being there too late. But my schedule didn't always cooperate. Some days I arrived later than planned, or I had to finish a set around 10:15 or 10:30. That's when the footsteps always came back. I'd try to keep my focus on my exercises, but my ears stayed alert for that steady sound. One night, I worked up the courage to check the corridor while the footsteps were still ongoing. I wanted to time it so I'd get there in the middle of whatever was happening. It was around 10:45 p.m. I was doing triceps pushdowns near the cable machine, which stands close to the entrance to the corridor. I heard the steps start. They were loud, like heavy boots. My pulse spiked, but I walked toward the corridor right away. My body felt tense, and my throat felt tight. My hands were slightly shaky. As I approached the corridor, the footsteps grew louder as if they were heading toward me. But when I turned the corner, the corridor was empty. The footsteps stopped at the exact moment I set foot in that space. There wasn't a single person in sight. The air felt thick and my skin prickled. I stepped to the locker room door. Again, I found it empty. The old activity room door was still locked. I stood there, every muscle in my body on high alert, waiting for something. Silence. I went back out and the receptionist looked at me with wide eyes like he was waiting to hear if I found anything. I just shook my head. He shrugged, looking kind of helpless. "Guess it's just another weird night," he said. I tried a different tactic the next time it happened. I told the receptionist I wanted to check the security cameras. There's a small office behind the desk. He said he wasn't really allowed to show me the feed unless there was an actual emergency, but he was curious too. So one night around 10 p.m., we both watched the screen while the corridor camera was on. There's a camera pointed right at that hallway because it shows people entering the locker rooms. We waited. Around 10:20, the footsteps started in real life. I felt a chill go down my back. We leaned forward, eyes locked on the monitor. The corridor on the screen stayed empty. We heard the steps clearly. Step, 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 but there was nobody on the footage. There wasn't even a shadow or a glitch, just an empty corridor. My heart was pounding so hard that I felt each beat in my neck. The receptionist looked pale. He turned to me and said, "Do you hear it right now?" I nodded. We could still hear it. But on the screen there was nothing at all. Then, about 10 seconds later, the footsteps stopped. The corridor returned to total silence. The receptionist exhaled and muttered something under his breath. Then he said, "I don't know what to tell you. This is way above my pay grade." At that point, I was done pretending I could ignore it. My workouts were suffering because I was jumpy and distracted. My form got sloppy and I almost dropped a dumbbell on my foot once. I started avoiding certain areas of the gym. I moved my workouts toward the entrance or to the machine area near the windows. But no matter what, I felt the corridor's presence in the back of my mind. I couldn't let it go. One Friday, I convinced a friend to join me for a late workout. I wanted a witness. I told him about the footsteps. He laughed and said, "Okay, man, I'll come with you. Maybe it's just some weird echo." We arrived at around 9:45 p.m. We did some warm-ups, bench press, pull-ups, the usual. I kept an eye on the clock. Around 10:30, I started hearing it. My friend was re-racking a plate when I grabbed his arm. "Listen," I whispered. He stopped moving. We stood there in silence. The footsteps echoed from the corridor. Step, 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 perfectly spaced. My friend's eyes went wide. He whispered, "That's not normal." We walked over together. I felt my pulse spike again, but I pushed forward because I wasn't alone this time. As soon as we stepped into the corridor, the footsteps vanished. My friend peered into the locker room. Empty. He tried the door to the old activity room. Still locked. He shook his head and looked confused. We stood there for a minute listening. Nothing. We went back out. I looked at the receptionist. He just gave me a small nod, acknowledging that he heard it too. My friend was spooked. He tried to act calm, but I could see the tension in his face. We tried to continue our workout, but I noticed him looking over his shoulder every time we walked near that part of the gym. Around 11 p.m., he said he was done and left. I stayed another 10 minutes to finish a quick ab routine. That was a mistake. I was the only one on the floor. The receptionist was in the office messing with some paperwork. I felt isolated and exposed. I kept looking over at the corridor, expecting the footsteps to start again. My heart was racing and my breathing felt shallow. My arms and legs were tired from the workout, but that tight feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. Finally, I gave up on finishing my last set. I grabbed my bag and headed toward the exit. As I passed by the corridor, I thought I heard the start of that steady walking. I didn't stop. I hurried out, waved bye to the receptionist, and made it to my car with my skin crawling. This routine went on for weeks. I avoided the corridor at all costs. If I had to go to the locker room, I waited until I saw someone else go in. Then I'd rush in behind them or choose a time when the receptionist could see me from a distance. I tried wearing noise-canceling headphones, but then I kept jumping at every small sound or vibration. It was worse not knowing if the footsteps were happening. Part of me wanted to hear them every time just so I didn't feel paranoid. Another part of me wanted them to vanish forever. I told a few more people at the gym. Some believed me. Some thought I was messing with them. A couple of guys said they heard it too, but they didn't seem too bothered. They said, "It's an old building, man. You get weird acoustics at night." But the ones who trained late at night admitted that it wasn't normal. One guy said he tried to record the sound on his phone but got nothing. He said it was either too faint or the microphone didn't pick it up clearly. Last week, I tried one more time to unlock the old activity room. I asked the manager during the day if I could see inside. He said there was nothing to see, just some mats and old exercise balls. He opened it up for me around 6 p.m. when there were people around. I stepped inside. It was empty. The walls had a few cracks, and there were some dusty floor mats stacked in the corner. There was no hidden hallway, no weird equipment, no open vents or anything like that. The manager locked it up again and handed me a shrug. See? Nothing in there. That night, the footsteps came back as usual around 10:20 p.m. This time, I didn't bother going to the corridor. I stayed on the main floor, tried to keep my eyes on my workout, and got through my sets as fast as I could. My shirt was sticking to my back. I was sweating more from nerves than from exercise. My mouth felt dry and I kept swallowing hard. When I finished, I grabbed my bag and hurried out. The footsteps were still going when I pushed the door open to leave. Now, I can't walk into that gym without feeling a knot in my stomach. I still go because I love lifting and it's the only 24-hour gym in my area. But I don't hang around after 10 p.m. unless I absolutely have to. When the footsteps start, I try to ignore them. Sometimes they fade after a minute. Sometimes they go on for 5 or 10 minutes at a stretch. They never seem to come earlier than 10. It's always at that same late hour when almost everyone is gone. The receptionist no longer brings it up. I think he's tired of dealing with the questions. He hears it too, I know he does, but he just shrugs and pretends it's no big deal. A couple of the regulars have started joking about it being the marching ghost, but nobody's seen anything. There's never any sign of a real person or any explanation. I'm not sure what's going on. I don't have theories. I just know I hear those footsteps, and I feel that spike of adrenaline every time. My hands get clammy, my breathing gets tight, and I can't focus. Now I cut my workout short to avoid that corridor. Maybe someday I'll figure out what's causing it. But for now, I'm not taking any chances. That's it. That's the story. Some nights, I'm the last one here. I can't stand the tension, so I leave early. Other nights, I try to be brave and stick around, but I always end up hearing that same steady sound. It echoes across the floor and the corridor stays empty. I don't know what's causing it, and I guess I might never find out. All I know is that I keep coming back to this gym. I just try to time my workouts so I'm not alone with those footsteps. If I ever find out the truth, I'll tell the receptionist. Until then, I'll stick to the machines up front and pretend I don't hear a thing. I was in that small town for a routine conference. I had flown in the night before, checked into a modest hotel, and spent most of the day in meetings. By late afternoon, I felt restless. My colleagues had other plans, but I wanted to clear my head. The hotel clerk suggested a stroll through the historic center. The way he described it made it sound quaint but quiet. I decided to see it for myself. I stepped out onto the main street. The sky was gray and the sidewalks were nearly empty. A slight breeze pushed at my collar. I moved past a bakery with its doors propped open. I smelled fresh bread. I remember hearing a faint hum of traffic from somewhere behind me. The storefronts in this old part of town looked worn. Cracks in the walls, faded paint, chipped signs. It reminded me of places I used to pass when I was a kid visiting relatives, though I had never been here before. I spotted a narrow street to my left that seemed different. There was a small lantern hanging from a pole and it flickered a little, even though it was barely evening. I turned down that street. It was quieter, dimmer. My shoes made a dull thud on the old pavement. I saw a small door with a sign on it. I couldn't read the letters at first because they were in some ornate font. I only caught the last word, which looked like gifts or goods. But the door was open, and a red light spilled out onto the sidewalk. It smelled like incense. I went inside. Right away, I felt a rush of warm air. It struck me as odd because I could see an air conditioning unit humming in the corner, but I didn't feel any cool breeze from it. The place was cramped. Shelves lined both walls, covered with statues, candles, bundles of dried herbs, and jars that seemed to hold powders or stones. Some of them had strange labels I didn't recognize. The floor looked old, polished wood, but it creaked with each step, and I felt a slight vibration whenever I moved. There was a small counter at the back. An old man stood there. He wore a simple shirt and trousers, nothing flashy, but his eyes fixed on me the second I crossed the threshold. There was something intense about his stare. He nodded, then said my first name in a casual tone. as if he'd known me for years. I froze. I hadn't introduced myself, or even spoken a word. I asked him how he knew my name. He just gave a slight smile. I felt sweat forming on my forehead, and my palms turned clammy. I glanced around for a nameplate or a customer log or anything that could explain how he knew me. I saw nothing. The only thing I heard was the gentle hum of the AC and a distant ticking sound, like a clock hidden somewhere. Then the old man reached under the counter, took out a small pendant and slid it toward me. It was a dark, round stone on a thin chain. He told me it was an amulet. His voice was low but clear. He said it would protect me from things I didn't even know were following me. He spoke as if this was the most natural claim in the world. I tried to ask him what he meant, but he only lifted his hand, palm facing me like he was telling me to wait or to stay silent. I felt a sudden tingling in my arms, like a mild electric shock. The old man kept his eyes on me, not blinking. I remember hearing my own heartbeat. That was how quiet it got. I took a step back because I wanted to leave. My stomach churned, but my legs felt heavy. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else. The floor seemed to pulse under my shoes. My mouth went dry. I licked my lips and tried to speak again, but words didn't come out right. I just mumbled something. The old man maintained that calm expression. Then he slid the amulet closer to me again, as if insisting I take it. I grabbed it. I don't know why. I just felt compelled. Maybe I wanted to end the uncomfortable moment. The stone felt warm in my hand, almost like it was alive. I dropped it into my jacket pocket and looked back at him. He gave me a quick nod like a goodbye. I left without saying thanks or anything else. It didn't seem right to stay there 1 second longer. Once I was outside, the air felt cooler. I realized I had been sweating. I wiped my forehead with my sleeve and glanced at the sky. It was getting darker. I could hear a few distant car horns and some chatter from other blocks. I tried to steady my breathing. I wanted to process what had just happened, but I told myself to keep walking. I headed back to the hotel, ignoring the faint tremble in my hands. That night I ate alone in the small hotel restaurant. The place was nearly empty. The waiters moved quietly. I kept thinking about the old man, about how he said my name. I reached into my pocket and felt the amulet. It was cold now. I placed it on the table for a second to look at it under the light. It was smooth on one side, a bit rough on the other. No symbols, nothing etched on its surface. I went to my room, took a shower, and got into bed. I didn't expect anything strange to happen, but I had trouble falling asleep. My mind raced. Eventually, I dozed off. That's when the first dream hit me. It felt more like I was plunged into another place. I saw a man and a woman arguing in a dimly lit apartment. I didn't know them, but I could make out every detail of their surroundings. A couch with torn cushions, a lamp flickering, a dirty window. They yelled at each other, but I couldn't understand the words. My heart pounded. I felt like I was an intruder. Then, in the corner of this dream, near the window, I saw the old man. He stood there, arms folded, watching me. Our eyes met, and I jolted awake. I was covered in sweat, gasping for air. The room was dark. The clock on the nightstand showed 3:24 a.m. I sat up, trying to calm myself. My chest felt tight, my hands shook. I reached over and turned on the lamp. My throat was so dry I couldn't swallow right. I looked at my jacket, which was draped over a chair, and saw that the pocket was partly open. I remembered the amulet was still in there. I thought about throwing it away, but something stopped me. I convinced myself it was just a weird dream. I tried to go back to sleep, but it took a long time. The next morning, I felt groggy. I showered and went to my conference sessions. The day passed in a blur of presentations and small talk. I tried to focus on the business at hand, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the dream. At lunchtime, I reached into my jacket and touched the amulet again. It gave me a jolt of nervous energy. I thought about heading to that street after the conference ended to see if the store was still there and maybe get some answers. Late in the afternoon, I got a break. I walked quickly to the same area. The streets seemed normal. I recognized the bakery from the day before. The smell of fresh pastries came from inside. I kept going until I reached the small lantern pole I had noticed, but there was no lantern now. The street looked more ordinary. I found the same door frame, or at least I thought it was the same one, but it was sealed shut with boards across it. There was graffiti on the boards. No sign, no red light, no smell of incense. I stopped a passing shop owner who was sweeping the sidewalk. I asked if there was a store that sold candles, herbs, or anything esoteric. He looked at me with a puzzled expression. He told me he'd never seen a place like that in this street. He said he'd lived here all his life and would know if something like that existed. I insisted I was there just yesterday. He shrugged, told me maybe I was mixing up the street. But I was sure I wasn't. That night my sleep was even worse. I had more dreams. Each time I saw different people in different places. Sometimes it was an office break room where two coworkers flirted awkwardly. Sometimes a narrow alley where a person paced back and forth, glancing over their shoulder. In all those scenes, I noticed the old man in the background, standing or sitting or leaning against a wall. He never said a word. He just stared at me. When I woke, I was drenched in sweat and short of breath. Over the next 2 days, I tried to carry on with my business. I went to meetings, took notes, smiled when required, but my nights were full of these vivid dreams. Each morning I felt weaker. My hands trembled. My appetite vanished. I tried to push these thoughts aside, telling myself there was a logical explanation. But part of me felt exposed, like someone was watching me all the time. I kept checking behind me when I walked around the hotel lobby or down the hallway. I just felt this constant sense that something was near. On the last day of my trip, I woke before dawn. I had barely slept, thanks to another dream. This time, I saw a woman sobbing on a park bench. I didn't know her. She just sat there, shoulders shaking, tears running down her face. In the dream, I walked up to her. That was when I noticed the old man sitting on a bench in the distance facing us. I spun around to confront him, but as soon as I moved, I woke up. I felt sore all over, like I had been running. My neck was stiff. My lower back hurt. I had a flight that afternoon, so I packed my things and checked out of the hotel. I hailed a taxi and headed for the airport. On the way, I made one final attempt to find the shop. I told the driver to stop at the corner near that bakery. He waited while I hurried down the street, but there was no trace of the esoteric store. The building I recognized was boarded up. Nothing else matched the memory of that place. Back in the cab, I felt angry. My chest tightened. I thought about ripping the amulet off and throwing it into the gutter, but I kept it. I don't know why. I left for the airport, boarded my plane, and went home. I spent the entire flight with my eyes half closed, dreading the next time I'd fall asleep. The dreams didn't stop after I got home. Every night, I saw more people I'd never met. Sometimes they argued, sometimes they laughed, sometimes they just stared into space. And always, at some corner of the dream, that old man watched me. I started to fear sleep. I stayed up until the early hours, reading or pacing around my apartment. My neighbors probably heard me walking back and forth. My eyes burned from lack of rest. My skin felt clammy most of the time. At work, my performance dropped. I got questioned by my boss about my focus. I made up some excuse about stress. I couldn't tell him the truth. I knew how crazy it would sound. One night, about 2 weeks after my trip, I decided I had to confront this situation. I remembered what the old man said. The amulet would protect me. But protect me from what? I wanted to know if there was a way to break this connection. I searched online for similar stories, but it was all vague nonsense or people hawking magical solutions. I found nothing that explained what was happening. At one point, I considered going back to that town, but I didn't have another business trip scheduled there, and I had no guarantee I'd find anything. A few days later, I started noticing something strange when I walked down the street in my own city. I kept catching glimpses of a figure in my peripheral vision like someone was tailing me. I'd turn around and there was nobody. or just a random pedestrian who didn't look like the old man. My heart would race each time it happened. My palms would sweat, and a buzzing sound filled my ears. But it was always a false alarm, or maybe I was losing it. I thought about throwing the amulet in a trash can, but I hesitated. Something about it felt like a link to that experience, and I needed to figure out if destroying it or discarding it would make things worse. One evening, I stood at my kitchen sink, holding the amulet above the garbage disposal. My hand shook. I gripped the chain, ready to drop it, but I stopped. My gut tightened, and I felt a cold chill on the back of my neck. I pulled it back and stuffed it into a drawer. My sleep continued to be broken and restless. The dreams never repeated. Each was a new scene with new people, but always that old man somewhere in the background. Sometimes he stood in a doorframe. Sometimes he peered through a window. Sometimes he leaned against a car. I never spoke to him. I never heard him say anything in those dreams, but his gaze was always fixed on me. I'm still dealing with it. This story doesn't have a neat ending because I haven't found a solution yet. I don't know why that old man chose me or how he knew my name. I don't know if he's real or if he was some stranger I hallucinated. I don't know what these dreams mean or if they even mean anything. I can only guess it has something to do with that amulet. Maybe it opened a door that won't close. Maybe it's messing with my mind. Every night I brace myself. I lie in bed and my heartbeat stays fast for a long time. I keep checking the edges of my vision when I walk to the bathroom or the kitchen. I've started triple locking my front door, even though I know that won't help with something that appears in my sleep. I haven't told anyone about this in detail. Most people wouldn't believe me. That's why I'm putting it into words here. I want to get it out of my head, if only a little bit. I don't know if I'll ever see that store again. Part of me hopes I do, so I can get some answers. Another part of me is terrified that I might. I can't imagine facing that old man again, hearing him speak my name in that calm, certain voice. But my life hasn't gone back to normal. The only thing I can do is push through each day and try to cope with these dreams at night. If I ever figure out how to stop them, I'll do it. But for now, all I can say is that place was real when I stepped inside. I felt that warmth, that vibration on the floor. I saw those shelves and the jars of strange powders. I smelled the incense. And I heard the old man speak my name without being told. That was real. Whatever happened next is still happening. I wish I could say I know how it ends, but I don't. All I know is I'll never forget that shop, and I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes.